Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the April 2025 Mid-Atlantic Council meeting here in Galloway, New Jersey. It's our first in-person meeting. It's good to see everyone. Let's get started with our first agenda item, the 2025 Mid-Atlantic State of the Ecosystem Report, Dr. Sarah Gacious. And the council later, after a presentation, will provide feedback on the new updated sections of the 2025 report and considerations for future report development. Sarah, are you ready?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to the members of the council. Sorry I can't be there in person, but we'll do our best with the online presentation here. If folks notice any issues with the slides or the audio, could you please jump in and stop me, and we'll try to make adjustments on this end. So thank you very much. So we're here to present the State of the Ecosystem Report for 2025. And I know many of you have seen these introductory slides before, but please bear with me for the newer council members. I just want to give a little background here. So the State of the Ecosystem, or you'll see the acronym SOE, is something that's produced annually, and this report is intended to provide ecosystem information and synthesis for fishery managers. So the indicators are linked to management objectives, and all the red highlighted things in here are links that'll either get you to the reference section or to some online resource. So the council can share this presentation with y'all, and you can follow along if you like. But basically, this report provides contextual information to the council. It's been evolving since about 2016, and what we're trying to do here is provide a fishery relevant subset of what might be called a full ecosystem status report in other regions. So we're trying to stay focused on your fishery management objectives. We emphasize open science in this report, so all of our data is online, our technical methods are online, there's full in-depth descriptions of the indicators online, and I'll point you to where those are. And this information is also used within your council ecosystem approach to fishery management process, as you'll see as we transition into the next agenda item, the EAFM risk assessment. So I'm showing you this graphic of what's called the Integrated Ecosystem Assessment, or IEA loop, over on the right-hand side of your screen. And in that, we tend to start with our goals and targets for ecosystem-based fishery management. From there, based on those goals, we develop indicators. The indicators are used to assess the ecosystem. We can then analyze uncertainty and risk and possibly evaluate strategies. And the council has already been basically through this loop once, but we're basically on the indicators and assessment portion here with this report. So we're keeping the structure the same this year as the report you received last year. So that structure starts with a graphical summary. The first 3 pages of the report after the shiny cover page are trying to summarize all of the outcomes of the report. So the page 1 is sort of a report card format that matches up fishery management objectives with some of our key indicators. Page 2 summarizes risks to meeting fishery management objectives. And page 3 is a snapshot of the conditions in 2024 that were reported to us. And so then each of the broader sections of the report expand on basically each of those pages. So we'll have a performance relative to management objectives section, a risks to meeting fishery management objectives section that includes climate and ecosystem risks, as well as offshore wind development. And then finally, we go through the 2024 highlights page. So I just want to briefly mention that we've updated a few of the tables in the report to better illustrate what types of objectives are matched with what indicators, or what types of risks are matched with what indicators. So I'm not going to go through these in depth right now because we'll see them later in the appropriate sections, but it's just to give you a sense of each of the objective sections has indicators aligned with it. Each of the risk sections have indicators aligned with them. And we do try to integrate a lot of indicators and information along the lines of each of these objectives or risks. The main reason for this is we're trying to, instead of giving you basically a pile of individual indicators, what we try to do is synthesize across the indicators And the reason for this is that there's a lot of moving parts in an ecosystem. So there's three basic themes to how we try to synthesize our indicators. The first is multiple system drivers. So that's basically we have a lot of different things that influence marine ecosystems, and those can be societal, biological, physical, or chemical. And they interact through a variety of pathways. That's the sort of infographic down there on the lower left. And then changes in these multiple drivers can lead to a couple of different things. Regime shifts is one thing that is possible. So that we define as a large, abrupt, and persistent change in the structure and function of an ecosystem. That's a little different from a regime shift in, say, an individual indicator. We do try to look at the full system. And those regime shifts and changes in the drivers could result in ecosystem reorganization. So that's the sort of graphic on the lower right-hand side there, where maybe in your first regime, you have a different species mix and a different temperature than in your second regime. It's not to say that one is necessarily better than the other, it's just that they're different. And so if we're in a different system, we may need to think about managing a bit differently. So what we're trying to do is bring together all of these concepts in this report. I'll tell you right now, we're probably more successful at the multiple system drivers than we are at the other two because they're just a bit more complex, but we wanted to kind of set that bar so that everyone can understand what we're trying to work towards here. So a little more practical information, the report scale and how to read the figures. So the spatial scale is there on the left-hand side. And you can see that we have, for the Mid-Atlantic State of the Ecosystem Report, a lot of our indicators are specific to the Mid-Atlantic Bight, which is the light blue section in the map there. There's also a New England State of the Ecosystem Report that covers the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank in the sort of darker blue sections. But we do have many indicators that are coast-wide indicators, and I'll do my best to remember to remind you of which are coast-wide indicators that are going to be common to both reports and cover that entire scale. Underneath there, there's a bunch of red links to our glossary of terms, our technical methods documentation, and our online indicator data. And to read the figures, this is a quick key so that we try to do all of our time series figures in sort of a consistent manner so that they're hopefully easier to read. So in this example figure, there's in the two panels, you'll see they're both time series. So time is on the x-axis there. And the y-axis is basically what the indicator is, the units of the indicator. So on the top is distance, on the bottom is depth. And you'll see that there's black dots and lines. That's generally the observations of the indicator. And if you see an orange line, that indicates a significant increasing trend. If you see a purple line, as in the bottom plot there, that indicates a significant decreasing trend in the indicator. If you don't see a line, there is not a significant trend detected. And the gray background is showing you the most recent 10 years so that you can tell immediately if we've got different length time series, and you can also kind of zoom in on what's been going on a bit more recently compared to the full time series. So in the documentation that we've given you is also a State of the Ecosystem request tracking memo. I'm not going to go through this at all during this presentation, but we welcome any questions you have on this. We did go through this a bit more with the Scientific and Statistical Committee a couple of weeks ago. But basically what we've done here is taken all of the requests and questions that we get about the report and tried to compile them. And they've been organized using a prioritization process that did involve Mid-Atlantic Council members a couple of years ago and both SSCs a couple of years ago and last year. And the idea is to sort of keep the full list of things that we've been asked about the report, but try to work on the ones that are highest priority for the council. I will try to note along the way as we go through here what some of the new things are in this year's report and try to take note of what requests that's in response to. So one of the first things that we changed in response to some of the requests is folks have been asking for some changes in the trend assessment that we do in the report. And so a quick overview here, we have a new way of assessing short-term trends. So you can see in the top plot over there on the right-hand side, it's got a long purple line for the whole time series. So that's that long-term trend I just talked about. It also has a short, darker purple line for the most recent 10 years of the data. So this is because Andy Beat, who works here at the center, developed a new package to look at the most recent 10 years of each data set and assess whether there's a trend there. And we are now also applying that same method to data sets that have less than 30 years. So for the first time in a long time this year, we're now assessing trends for data sets that are not 30 years or more long. So you'll see some changes in the report based on that. The other change we've made is the polynomial, or basically the curved trends that we were assessing up until this year. A lot of people had questions about them, and sometimes it was difficult to tell whether they should be an increasing or decreasing trend if it's basically just going up and down. So this year we're not using those. This does have some implications for the risk assessment scoring, but we'll talk about that a little bit in the next presentation. But the plot on the bottom right-hand side there, that's the Mid-Atlantic revenue trend. And that used to have a long-term decreasing trend because it was basically a curved line across those black dots. So we no longer assess those, so that one no longer comes up with a long-term trend. So just to be kind of clear about that change this year. So I'm going to give you a quick summary from our summary pages, which are shown here, but obviously you're not meant to be able to read them. And then we'll go into depth for each of the sections for the rest of the presentation. So for the first section, performance relative to management objectives, the real quick overview here is seafood production is declining and below the long-term average in the Mid-Atlantic. Profits, which is represented by the revenue time series, has no long-term trend. And I just showed you that on the last slide. That's because we've stopped using the polynomial trends, but it is well below the long-term average. For recreational opportunities, there's two sets of indicators. Effort is increasing and above the long-term mean, but effort diversity is decreasing and below the long-term mean, suggesting a sort of constraining of fishing opportunities. For stability, we've used a lot of the same indicators this year, but we're assessing them differently. So we're just asking whether things are stable or not stable. And we welcome your feedback on whether this is useful to you. But in general, the indicators are showing that both fishery and ecological indicators are not stable in the Mid-Atlantic. For our social and cultural objectives, we have fishing engagement and social vulnerability status by each community. And this year we've included the full suite of communities in the Mid-Atlantic and in New England in our data. So it's been expanded. Those are not time series, however, those are snapshots based on 2022. And there's new indicators that are time series looking at revenue climate vulnerability. In the Mid-Atlantic, we are not seeing trends in that by communities, but we are seeing that the majority of communities are falling into a high or very high risk category for climate vulnerability of revenue. And then we have protected species objectives, which are generally maintaining bycatch below thresholds. So those objectives are being met for gray seals and harbor porpoise, but there's some different trends in the bycatch for those two species. And then for recovering endangered populations, the North Atlantic right whale, that's NARW there on the slide, has been decreasing, is below its recovery objective still. So we'll go into each of those in more detail. I wanted to give you the summary. For the risks to meeting fishery management objectives, this is broken into three parts for climate risks. First is risks to managing spatially. Then we go into risks to managing seasonally, and finally risks to catch specification. And the observations that we have under each of those is that we are continuing to observe fish and protected species distribution shifts. We are observing changing spawning and migration timing for managed species. And we are seeing multiple stocks that have poor condition and declining productivity. Not all of them, but there are many stocks in that condition. For other ocean uses, the main thing we focus on is offshore wind development in this report. And the current revenue in proposed areas is one of the things we report. So that can range from 1 to 46% by Mid-Atlantic ports and from 2 to 16% of revenue by Mid-Atlantic council managed species. There is overlap with important right whale foraging habitats and the wind areas, which could mean increased vessel strike and noise risks. And then finally, we have our 2024 highlights page. So this here is trying to give notable 2024 events and conditions. So what's interesting about 2024 is that globally, 2024 was the warmest year on record. And I have, again, I don't need to ever change this, unfortunately. We said that in 2023, but 2024 beat it globally. Interestingly, though, on our portion of the coast, we are seeing cooler conditions across the coast in 2024. There was a well-established Mid-Atlantic fold pool. There was summer upwelling events off of New Jersey, as well as some extreme ocean acidification measured off New Jersey. And there's a lot of observations of different spatial and timing patterns and changed abundance for different fish species. We saw good scallop recruitment in Nantucket lightship, a lot of red drum in Chesapeake Bay, There were Arctic copepods in the Gulf of Maine, a big coccolithophore bloom off of New York. You can see that in the picture over there on the right-hand side. And there were large whale aggregations seen offshore. So another new thing we've introduced this year is an email address where anyone can send us the observations that you have, and we welcome those. I'll talk a little bit more about this during this section, but the email address is right there, Northeast Ecosystem Highlights at NOAA.gov, and we would love to hear from people with the things that you're seeing out there in the field. Okay, so that was the summary. Now I'll go into a little bit more depth on the performance relative to management objectives section. So for seafood production in the Mid-Atlantic, I'll just orient you to this slide a little bit. So I'm going to show you the trends and status indicators that we had from the summary page. And then I'm also going to link this to, if there are links to the Mid-Atlantic risk assessment. So for the risk assessment, this is the commercial food and recreational food elements, and they're both ranking moderate to high risk right now. So they're colored in orange, and we'll circle back to that. But the reason for that is the long-term trends that you're seeing in all of these indicators. So for commercial landings over there on the left-hand side, top of the screen, you can see there's a significant decrease in the total commercial landings in the Mid-Atlantic. That's the black line, and that includes everything, whether it's seafood or not. So that would include Atlantic menhaden and herring that's used for bait, etc. Whereas the blue line includes the total seafood landings, but that could be managed by anyone, whether it's the Mid-Atlantic Council or not. And then the red line includes the Mid-Atlantic managed seafood. So those don't have significant 40-year trends, but they are near the time series low recently. So that's a bit of a concern there. A new indicator we have for this year is the total climate vulnerability of landings. You're seeing that in the bottom left-hand side of the screen. And what that is doing is taking the landings by port and sort of matching those with the climate vulnerability ranking for the species. And so a port's composition of species would have a certain climate vulnerability based on what species were in there. And what this does is sum those across all of the Mid-Atlantic ports. And so what you're seeing here is that the landings across all Mid-Atlantic ports tend to be in the moderate climate vulnerability range, although there is an increasing trend there, and most recently coming up into the high climate vulnerability range. This is a new indicator. It only goes up to 2021 right now. We're still kind of working on some of the data, especially in the recent years. So there could be some caveats with this, but we think this is an interesting thing to show. So it's, you have decreasing landings, but you can have increasing vulnerability of the landings at the same time. For recreational harvest, what you see there is both on the top, the sort of Mid-Atlantic and New England managed species and ASMFC managed species, basically data from MRIP on the top, showing a decline in recreational seafood harvest. And on the bottom are shark landings that are recreational. So we've got both MRIP recreational shark landings and also pelagic shark landings from a different data source, but they're all showing the same thing, which is a decline in landings. So we've got these decline in landings. What could be causing that? And in the report, we go through multiple potential drivers, and I'll give you a little taste of what those are here. So it could be that there's a change in ecosystem production or stock production, it could be management driven, it could be market conditions and environmental change, or a combination of these multiple drivers. So what we try to do is walk through the indicators and see what hypotheses are supported there and what might be a little more difficult to support. So for instance, we can look at the stock status over there on the left-hand side of your screen. Those are the Mid-Atlantic managed stocks. And so it's basically plotting the biomass relative to the biomass target, biomass at MSY, and the fishing mortality relative to the fishing mortality target on the y-axis, F to FMSY. And where you want to be is in the lower quadrant of this. Let's see if you can see yeah, it looks like you can see that. You want to be down here. Right? So then you're meeting the objectives for all the species. So the species in green, they're both above their biomass target and below their fishing mortality limit. So that's exactly where we want to be. Bluefish are, they're above the biomass threshold, so they're still not considered depleted or overfished, but they're well below the fishing mortality target. And then there's 3 species that are either above the fishing mortality target, golden tilefish and summer flounder, or below the biomass lower limit, which is Atlantic mackerel. So there's 3 species not meeting the objectives right now. but most of them are, and there's several that are unknown, and so we don't know where to put them. But basically, this suggests that since most of them are meeting the objectives, probably it's not stock status that's driving the low landings. When we look also at the indicators of total ABC or ACL and realized catch relative to the management target, we're not seeing really big declining trends in the ABCs. And we're seeing that most species on the bottom right there tend to, the red line is showing the median. Most of them are catching just below the amount that would be allowed by the ABC or the ACL. And so it suggests that management isn't necessarily playing a strong role in this, that the species aren't hitting their limits necessarily each year. And so then we can also look at the biomass in the ecosystem. So that's over on the left-hand side of your screen. And if we were to see declines in the overall biomass in the system, and what you're seeing there is biomass broken up by basically trophic level. So we see at the very top of the screen, we have the piscivores or the fish eaters, and it's both spring and fall in each column. And then we have benthivores and then planktivores and benthos at the bottom. And we do not see any declining trends across any of these groups. We actually see increasing trends for spring piscivores, for fall benthivores, which is hard to see in the screen, sorry, and also for fall benthos. The red lines there are the NEOMAP survey. The black lines are from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center bottom trawl survey. NEOMAP's not really showing greatly different trends, although sometimes it's a little higher, sometimes it's a little lower than the bottom trawl survey. So that suggests, again, that it's not changing biomass in the ecosystem, that's changing the landings. So what could be doing this? When we look at the landings in the same groupings, so piscivore, planktivore, benthivore, and benthos over there on the right-hand side, we see planktivores have a significant decline in the mid-Atlantic. That's in the black line, so that is the total landings, and that's mostly driven by consolidation in the menhaden fishery. And we do see, even though it's not long-term significant, that benthos in the mid-Atlantic has been coming down since about the mid-2000s, both the mid-Atlantic managed in red and the total. And this suggests that since they're not hitting their limits and they're not in they're in a good sort of status in terms of the stocks, that is probably market-driven. So the recreational drivers, however, are a little bit different. Shark fishery management is driving some of those declines, and it's possible that the change in survey methodology for the recreational fishery in 2018 is also changed a little bit the scale of that. However, it seems to be stabilizing. So there's other things going on here, and we'll talk about those in the rest of the report. So there's climate risks, including warming, ocean acidification, and shifting distributions that we'll be talking about that can also come into play here with the landings. There's also changes in ecosystem composition and production and in fishing engagement throughout the region. So that was sort of the long way through for one of our indicators to see what some of the drivers may be. And some of these drivers apply to the next sets of objectives. So I promise you we'll get through them more quickly. First, we have the objective of commercial profits, and this is the one where we no longer have a long-term trend, but we are well below the long-term average. As you can see in the top left there, the commercial revenue indicator is showing a steep decline recently for total revenue and a decline also for Mid-Atlantic managed revenue, pretty close to the time series low. For both of those, it's been pointed out that revenue is not the same thing as profits. We are using it as a proxy for profits here, but Garrett DePiper has been developing, along with colleagues, some profit indicators that are currently under SSC review. So we may be able to bring you more information on that in future reports. Similar to the total climate vulnerability of landings, we can look at the total climate vulnerability of revenue, and that's what you see in the bottom left-hand slide of the screen there. And for this, it's pretty interesting that when you sum up across all of the Mid-Atlantic communities, what you see is that in general, the revenue, it has a fairly high climate vulnerability. There's no long-term trend, but you can see in a couple of years, it's gotten into the very high category of climate vulnerability. And one of the reasons for this is that you'll see that over there on the right-hand side of the screen, when we look at the Bennett indicator, which separates the price and volume components of revenue, we can see, first of all, that we have a 1982 baseline, and in all years, except for the most recent two, we've been doing better than that. So that's the first part of the story. But in 2022 and 2023, we have dropped back below that level in relative terms, and that's driven by both price and volume, especially in the most recent year, 23. And that's broken down into groupings of species on the bottom right-hand side. So the orange that you're seeing there, that's benthos. And you can see benthos has a large contribution to price, and that was holding the price up for quite a while, about half the time series, but that started to drop off in the last couple of years. And you can see the volume indicator in the bottom. The volume of them has also gone down. And so a lot of what's going on with the revenues in the system has to do with benthos. And the benthos, the clams, the quahogs, the scallops, those tend to be climate vulnerable species. And so that kind of links together across a lot of these indicators that we're seeing here. For the next objective is recreational opportunities. So we've got two indicators showing sort of different things here. One is showing that recreational effort is increasing. It's got a long-term increase. So overall, there's a lot of opportunities in the Mid-Atlantic, and it's above the long-term mean. But when we look at the types of opportunities, we can see recreational fleet effort diversity is decreasing. So this was our example from the short-term trend plot, and so you're seeing it again here. It's decreasing in the long term and also in the most recent 10 years. The reason for this is basically that the party charter portion of the fleet has been contracting, and there's more shore-based angling in the region. And so when you look at the Mid-Atlantic risk assessment criteria, basically you wind up with a pretty high risk for that recreational diversity and a low to moderate risk for recreational value based on these indicators. The next objective is fishery stability. So two components to stability, the fishery and the ecosystem. So for these fishery indicators, what we look at are several diversity and sort of fleet count indicators. And so the commercial fleet count, which is the top left-hand indicator, it has a long-term decrease in the Mid-Atlantic. But the fleet diversity and revenue is pretty steady. That's the plot just below that on the left-hand side. And when we look at the Mid-Atlantic permit revenue species diversity, that actually increased quite a bit in the most recent year, 2023. So that actually got rid of a trend that used to be there before. So what we're seeing is the fleet diversity risk element is at a moderate to high risk in orange, but the fishery resilience indicator is at a low risk in green. The recreational diversity of catch similarly does not have a long-term trend, and we're seeing the most recent year being fairly high. So a little bit higher catch diversity for both commercial and recreational most recently. When we look at the ecological stability indicators, we look at a range of indicators here. So first we look at primary production in the top left-hand side. We're seeing fairly steady primary production in the Mid-Atlantic, which is probably good news. We wouldn't want to see big fluctuations in that. But when we look at the lower left, that is the zooplankton diversity index, and we're seeing an increase in zooplankton diversity. This is driven by there being basically fewer of a more common species in the Mid-Atlantic. That means so there's more of the other species going on. So an increase in diversity isn't necessarily a good or a bad thing, it's just different. And so we flag it to show that things aren't necessarily stable, not that we think this is bad or good. For the fish richness and traits, the survey expected number of species on the top right-hand side is flat, as it's been for quite a while. We distinguish between the two survey vessels because we can't really compensate for the fact that they might catch different numbers of species. But we have a new indicator this year, which is some species trait, fish community trait indicators. And so what this does is it looks at all the different fish species in the Mid-Atlantic and asks about, like, as a whole, has their length at maturity changed? Has their weight at maturity changed? Has there a bunch of other different indicators of sort of life history traits? I'm only showing length at maturity here, but there's trends in several of them. And interestingly, there are sometimes different trends by season. So what you're seeing is a decline in length at maturity for the fish community in the fall and an increase in the spring. So this suggests that the fish community is dominated basically by different life histories over time in the two seasons. So that suggests, again, an instability in the system. We're not sure if it's good or bad, but it is something that is changing and probably worth another look. Moving on to the community, social, and climate vulnerability indicators. So the risk element for this combines both what I'm showing you here and some indicators that we have in our online catalog but are not shown in the State of the Ecosystem report. And for that one, it's a moderate to high risk overall. So it's orange for social. So what we're showing here is a very similar plot to what we've shown in the past, but the difference is now all of the communities are on it. So you can see there's a lot of dots down there in the lower left-hand side of this figure. And the ones that are marked with names are the ones that show up in the table over on the right-hand side of the slide. And so it's basically fishery engagement along the x-axis, and that's measured in things like the total landings in a community, the number of processors, et cetera, number of permits. And over on the y-axis are those same indicators, but relative to the population. So it's trying to get at the fact that a very big community could have high landings just because it's big, whereas a small community could have really high landings considering the number of people that are fishing in it. And we want to be able to understand both types of community. So what you see here is something like Barnegat Light, New Jersey, has much higher relative engagement for its population size than a lot of other communities, whereas you get something like Reedville, Virginia, or Cape May, New Jersey, have just very high engagement overall due to the just sheer volume of things moving through those communities. The table on the right-hand side is showing you some of the other challenges that these communities may be facing in terms of the demographics in the community. And so we tend to highlight some communities that might have high indicators for either personal disruption, population composition, poverty. There's multiple other social indicators that are included in the online data set, including 2 economic indicators and 3 more gentrification indicators if folks are interested. And so we could bring those in if the council would like to see them. But generally it highlights things like, some of these communities have different indicators. So Cape May has a low, medium, or low. Whereas if you look down at, I think it's Atlantic City further down the list, they have high indicators for all of these. So it just gives some sense of how the different communities might be more or less capable of adjusting to change given the community composition. We've added this indicator here. So this is another commercial fishery revenue climate vulnerability, but this time we're looking at it by the proportion of individual communities in this category. So the map on the right is showing you the sort of current state of community total revenue vulnerability. And so all of the red communities there have fairly high revenue vulnerability, which means they're catching species that have higher climate vulnerability, right? And so the plot over on the left-hand side is showing you over time how the proportion of communities in each category has changed. And you can see there aren't really long-term trends here, but we do see that a majority of communities in the Mid-Atlantic are either in the orange or the red line, either high or very high climate vulnerability, indicating that most of the communities are dependent on species that have high total climate vulnerability. So that's for the commercial fishery. Then we can also look at similar indicators for recreational fishery engagement and social vulnerability. And so it's the same idea, but it's different indicators that go into characterizing the recreational fishery engagement. And you can see there's quite a few Mid-Atlantic communities that are highly involved in recreational fishing, as I'm sure everyone knows. Some of them are also the ones that are highly engaged in commercial fishing. So they're overlap there, and it's useful to know that, again, to understand how communities might react to changes in different fishery management. So you can see Cape May there still at the top of the list. These are the same social vulnerability indicators that we're showing. You can see that it's just a different set of communities because it's a different set that are more engaged in recreational fishing. So now we go to the protected species objectives, which include maintaining bycatch below thresholds and also recovering endangered populations. And so these are the bycatch indicators. And you can see for both harbor porpoise and gray seal, that's harbor porpoise on the top and gray seal on the bottom on the left. The red line is showing the maximum allowed bycatch. It's basically the potential biological removal, PBR is the name of that red line. And you want the blue line, which is the rolling mean of bycatch, to be below that. And so you can see it is for both of those. However, for gray seal on the bottom, you can see that the uncertainty is actually a little bit higher recently, and that's due to changes in observer coverage, as well as some of that was pandemic related, but some of it is just changes in observer coverage overall. And also gray seal do have among the highest bycatch of any US marine mammal. And so that's one to maybe look at a little bit more closely, especially as the PBR is updated in the coming years. but basically still meeting objectives here. The risk elements relevant to this are technical interactions, which are evaluated by species. And so most of the mid-Atlantic species have fairly low interactions with marine mammals and other species, 14 of them, with 7 low to moderate and 2 moderate to high, depending on the fishery. Then we have the recovering endangered populations. So here is the trajectory for North Atlantic right whales. And you can see that they were increasing and then had a decrease. And in the last few years, the population's pretty much stabilized, which is, it's better news than continuing to decline. However, they're still not meeting their recovery objectives. So that one is still considered below the recovery objective. We do see, though, that in recent years, the calf abundance has recovered from the 0 calves that were recorded in, I believe that was 2017. And so that's at least hopeful. We have a lot of stressors involved with the right whales, and that includes things like wind development and vessel interactions, et cetera. There are still unusual mortality events ongoing for 3 large whale species. So that would be this one, North Atlantic right whale, as well as humpback and minke whales in our region. All right, so that was the first section. You made it through. The next section here is risks to meeting fishery management objectives. And here is where we talk about the climate and ecosystem risks. So again, we reorganized this section last year to try to more directly connect some of our indicators to some of the management that councils need to do. And those 3 types of management, we've divided into spatial management, seasonal management, and setting catch limits. And so you can see the table there aligns first an observation indicator. So what is our observation about spatial or seasonal or catch limit risks? And then what are the potential driver indicators? So that's the way we're going to move through this section. So first of all, we are observing, these are coast-wide indicators in this section. So this section is looking at the distribution all the way from North Carolina up through Maine. And we see that there are still fish distribution shifts as we update these indicators. They're moving northeast along the shelf. That's what the orange line on the left indicates. And they're also moving generally into deeper water. That's what the purple line is indicating on the left-hand side. These are for all of the fish species combined on the Northeast Fisheries Science Center trawl survey. So that's representing fish. We also have some studies of cetacean distribution shifts. So whales and dolphins have been moving as well. This one's seasonal, so it breaks it up into winter, spring, summer, and fall for different species. You can see that in many seasons, many of these species are moving in the same direction as the fish, although there are a couple that are kind of bucking the trend in a couple of seasons there. So I think were we able to look at fish with that sort of resolution, I'm sure we would see similar things. What is driving these? Well, some of the drivers are probably changes in forage. And so we do have indicators of the center of gravity of both pelagic forage fish and benthic forage, benthic invertebrates that are introduced this year. And there's also some for zooplankton that are not shown here. Basically, what they're showing is that the forage fish and also small copepods are in at least one season moving the same direction that we're seeing for fish. That's to the northeast. However, the benthic indicators are showing a different direction or no direction. So the macrobenthos is actually moving westward over time, and some of the large zooplankton are doing a similar thing. So what we're seeing there is basically that the forage may not be moving the same direction as the fish, and so that could be complicating some of the species interactions in the system. We're also seeing changing ocean habitat. So I think we've been showing this long-term sea surface temperature time series on the top right for quite a while. It starts in the 1850s and shows a very clear increasing trend in temperature throughout the whole Northeast US shelf, with the most recent 10 years being quite high. There's also the Western Gulf Stream Index, and that's showing that the Gulf Stream itself, the north wall of that, is becoming further north over time. That's not, the full Gulf Stream is actually doing something a bit different that we'll talk about in the 2024 section. There's also the Mid-Atlantic cold pool that we can measure the temperature and spatial extent. So the temperature in the cold pool has a long-term warming trend, and the spatial extent of the cold pool has been getting smaller over time. But I'll draw your attention to the most recent data point on both of those plots, and it's back to pretty close to the normal line. So 2024 had a pretty normal cold pool compared to recent years, which is pretty interesting. So I'm not going to read you all of the implications or future considerations of this, But basically, the idea is that we are seeing these distribution shifts, and they're probably going along with the long-term trends. There can be short-term events that will change the sort of drivers, but that the species distribution shifts will probably persist for a bit longer. What's interesting is there are some long-term oceanographic projections that are suggesting a temporary pause in warming over the next decade, and we are seeing some indication that things are not just continually marching towards the warmer in our system in the indicators we have right now. So this is a good time to start really looking at something, trying to keep monitoring these shifts in distribution and try to understand what implications they have for our fisheries and communities. And obviously the councils are doing quite a bit of work on this already with the East Coast Climate Scenario Planning and the East Coast Climate Coordination Group, which does get this report as well. So any feedback you have that we can make this more useful for those processes, we're most welcome. The next section is risks to managing seasonally, and these are also coast-wide indicators. You'll notice that I'm showing things like yellowtail flounder and haddock in this slide, but there are indicators in development for mid-Atlantic species here. The main point here is that we are seeing a change in spawning timing, and these stocks show it pretty well. And the yellowtail southern New England stock is in the mid-Atlantic. So basically what this is showing you is those orange lines for spring spawners are showing you that there's been an increase in the fish that are finished spawning in the spring survey. That's because the timing of spawning has gotten earlier for haddock in the Gulf of Maine and George's Bank. Those are the bottom two plots. And for yellowtail flounder in southern New England. So they're finished spawning by the end of the survey. Whereas in George's Bank, it's kind of a wash. It's probably due to when the survey crosses George's Bank. And then the northernmost stock of yellowtail, that one, we're actually, the survey is increasingly getting into spawning. So you're seeing a decline in the number of resting fish. They're actually starting to spawn. That's the purple line there. So it's pretty interesting that the spawn timing can change so much for some of these stocks, and even within the same species, depending on where they are. So it's, I think, important to keep looking at these to make sure that if we are doing management that is linked to spawning timing, that we make sure that we're still on the same page with what the fish are doing. We're also seeing recreational tuna fisheries starting a month or more, up to 2 months earlier in the year over the past 20 years or so. Cape Cod Bay peak habitat use by humpback whales has shifted, but it's actually later over time. So this again is showing that not everything is moving in the same direction. And new this year, we have baseline information on seasonal presence of large whales at that link there in the indicator catalog. That's really interesting, showing very different timing use by a lot of these animals. So something to keep our eyes on. What could be driving this? Well, we're seeing changes in the thermal transitions in the ecosystem and in habitat persistence, as well as bloom timing. So the top left-hand slide is basically showing you the length of ocean summer. It's the time between spring and fall transition in the mid-Atlantic bight. And ocean summer's been getting longer over time. Similarly, we have the cold pool seasonal persistence. So how long is that cold pool feature there at the bottom of the mid-Atlantic? And we see that that's been declining, so it's been there for less time. Although again, this year it was much closer to normal, that very last data point. And then the bloom timing in the mid-Atlantic is pretty interesting. So basically the bigger bloom is towards the fall in the mid-Atlantic. And you see that in the November and December, the last two panels on the top right-hand side there. But what we're seeing is a significant increase in chlorophyll in January, suggesting that the bloom may be extending more into winter. So a change in seasonality there, and also a significant decline in chlorophyll in September, which might be associated with that later turnover, which would create a bloom. So it's pretty interesting that we're seeing these seasonal timing changes, but we feel like we don't have enough indicators of these. And so I think there's work to be done to try to get a little more attention on this, so that any management measures that are seasonal can be properly aligned with how things are changing in the system. And then finally, we have the risks to setting catch limits in the mid-Atlantic. And so the observations here are fish productivity and condition. What we see over on the left-hand side are two different sources of fish productivity information. The top is from surveys, the bottom trawl survey, and the bottom is from stock assessments. And both of them are pretty much showing that basically the recruitment per spawner anomalies have been low since about the mid-2000s and up until the present. Even though these are very different data sets. they are showing us kind of similar things, that fish productivity may have dropped in the mid-Atlantic from what it was prior to 2000 or so. And on the right-hand side is the condition factor for species sampled in the mid. And so you're not meant to be able to see all of these, but they basically are as many species as we can get the data for in the mid-Atlantic bight. And this is showing their how fat they are for their length. So if the square is yellow, that fish is fatter than we expect for its length. And if the square is dark blue, that fish is skinnier than we expect for its length. So you can see there was a whole stretch of skinny fish from about the early 2000s to almost 2010 there, where a lot of species showed poor condition. You can see that it was better condition before that for a lot of species. And since then, several species have had pretty good condition, whereas there's others towards the bottom of the screen there that have continued to have poor condition all the way up until the most recent year. So seeing condition changes across multiple species does suggest that that's something in the ecosystem that's driving that and not something inherent to the stock. And so we can look at what some of those drivers might be. And again, we can look at forage quality and abundance. So we see the forage fish energy content has been collected systematically. We're working on getting a pretty good time series here from folks who have worked pretty hard to collect this on the surveys recently. And what we see are real seasonal differences in forage quality, basically the fat content in our forage fish. In particular, Atlantic herring seems to be lower quality now than was estimated in the 1980s and 90s. Those are the black lines and the dotted lines on these plots. However, those were based on pretty small sample sizes, so there's a lot of ongoing work on that to try to understand the seasonal fluctuations and what that might be related to in the forage energy content. But obviously that can affect fish condition and reproductive success. When we look at the bottom plot there, that's the aggregate forage fish index. This is an index of 20 different forage fish based on stomach contents, and we can see there's a long-term decline in that in the mid-Atlantic during the fall and no trend in the spring. So they're more abundant in the fall though. And there's some new indicators of benthos abundance. So there's macrobenthos and megabenthos, two different size categories. And what we see is the bigger ones, the megabenthos on the top there, are showing an increasing trend during spring, no trend in the fall. The bottom plot is showing macrobenthos. They're smaller, and there's more of them. So this is things like all the little benthic invertebrates that a lot of our mid-Atlantic species eat. That's showing a long-term decline in the spring and no trend in the fall. So these are things that we need to dig into a bit more to understand what's going on here, because that could easily be affecting fish productivity. Finally, we're looking at some of the low trophic level drivers. So again, the primary production doesn't really have a trend, but we do see trends in the zooplankton in the mid-Atlantic. So large copepods over there all the way to the left are really highly variable without trend. We're seeing small copepods have a declining trend in the fall and also recently in the spring. That's the middle plot. But we're seeing euphausiids having an increasing trend in both seasons. So this is a real change in the zooplankton community composition by season, and something that's probably pretty important to what fish and the trophic levels above them are all eating. So again, some changes in the system to keep an eye on here that can be affecting productivity. Finally, there's other environmental drivers like ocean acidification. So what we're seeing here are ocean acidification levels measured relative to what would be a sensitivity level for Atlantic sea scallop over on the left-hand side and for longfin squid on the right-hand side. Now that cooler water that we had in 2024 was associated with actually higher acidification risk for these two species. And you can see that in the very light blue, that sort of teal colored line there where that's measured. So those were areas where it was outside the sensitivity level for those species, indicating a potential risk. The purple or the sort of pink color is from 2023, and all years before that are in a green color. So it's kind of like we're seeing increasing potential ocean acidification here. And predation is another potential driver here, where we've got kind of mixed trends. So we know there's increasing seals, especially up in New England, but it's a mix of population status for the highly migratory species in the region. So to kind of sum up here, there's a lot going on with fish productivity and mortality and a lot of multiple system drivers. But basically, it's really important to keep doing what we've been doing in the assessments, which is to look at the underlying conditions and figure out how to account for changes in growth, reproduction, natural mortality, as we are assessing these species so that we can understand the impacts on things like projections and reference points. It's important to keep looking at the system-wide productivity shifts to see if there's something like a regime shift. We don't think we necessarily have this yet, but we need to keep looking at the evidence to make sure that the system that we think we're operating in is the system that we're operating in when we're trying to manage. So the final section here is on offshore wind development, and this is just a summary of some of the indicators here. So these indicators are from 2024, and we do realize that there's been quite a bit of change recently in the potential for offshore wind development, but I just want to note that we are keeping these indicators up to 24 just so the council has this information. So basically you can see the fishery and community specific revenue from the lease areas. In general, what we see are that it's surf clam and longfin squid, especially recently, would have most of the revenue that would be in the areas proposed for leasing. We can see the port revenue from the leased areas, and there's Cape May and Newport News, some of the most highly engaged ports also have some of their revenue from the leased areas. So the darkest blue is the minimum amount of revenue from that area over the time period you see in the plot. The medium blue is the maximum, and then the light blue is revenue that comes from outside leased areas in these bar plots. The other thing that the council's asked us for that we try to provide each year is which New England ports rely on mid-Atlantic managed species, and you can see that in the bottom left-hand side there. So that's this year it's Point Judith, North Kingston, Hyannis, and Menemsha, Massachusetts. And so they have a similar range of reliance on the wind areas. So the implications of wind development is the plans, the current plans, or at least the plans as of the beginning of January, were for a build out in a real patchwork of areas. So the impacts would be really different throughout the region. But we do know that some of the leased areas overlap with the North Atlantic right whale habitat. You can see that in the plot on the right-hand side there, with hotspot persistence being high in the more red areas. And you can see how that overlaps with some of the wind areas. So that does increase risk to some of our endangered species in the region. Last section here is the highlights section. So the way we compile this was new last year, and we tried to have a broader reach this year, is we solicit observations from folks already contributing to the State of the Ecosystem Report, from other colleagues throughout the center and academia, from management partners, and also from the fishing industry. And I'll reiterate that we now have an email address, and we would love to have people's observations coming into this report. We do include them if we see record high or low observations of something, if things are really different from what we've experienced recently, if multiple sources are reporting the same thing, if there's effects on fishery operations, or if they're newsworthy. We do not consider this an exhaustive list of all the things that were important in 2024, and we are not sure what the full impacts of some of these things will be, but we just put them here so that the council hears about them first, if you will. And one thing that we did not get in time to put in here, but I really wanted to show in the presentation, was the Cape Cod Commercial Fishermen's February 2025 newsletter had this, this extract from it. And these really cool shells have been brought up by a gill netter who's been working south of Nantucket. So these are tropical and subtropical species. Things that this person with a lot of experience is only seeing recently. So this type of information is exactly what we would like to see in this report. And we do appreciate the shout out from Cape Cod Commercial Fishermen's Alliance, and keep bringing it, guys. We'd love to have that in the report. Our deadlines, though, are usually like early February, unfortunately. So thank you for that. But what we did see in 2024 is a generally cooler, fresher Northeast shelf. Even though it was globally the warmest year on record, we had cooler conditions regionally. A lot of our temperatures, it's at both surface and bottom, are back to the long-term average. We only recorded one small heat wave in the Gulf of Maine this year, as opposed to previous years where there would have been multiples throughout our systems. And it does seem like there's maybe more Labrador slope and also Scotian shelf water coming into the Gulf of Maine. You can see from 2023 that this was the first year that there was more Labrador slope water coming in through the Northeast Channel than the more Gulf Stream water in red for quite a long time, for about a decade. This is all linked to the better developed 2024 Mid-Atlantic cold pool that was observed. And these things led to some observations from multiple people of different timing, location, and abundance of species. So it kind of comes back to our spatial and seasonal types of observations. It's from this year. It was observed that there were delayed migration of longfin squid, black sea bass, and haddock, unusual locations for multiple species, some local abundance of Atlantic mackerel that wasn't seen before, and record catches of red drum in Chesapeake Bay. There was a good scallop recruitment in Nantucket lightship and Arctic copepods up in the Gulf of Maine. And there's that picture again of the coccolithophore bloom off New York. So that's unusual for this region, but not necessarily something that would be considered bad. They do get eaten. They show up turquoise like that because they have this very reflective calcium carbonate in them. So they're like little reflectors in the water, but they do get grazed. So we did see this extreme observation of ocean acidification off New Jersey and multiple summer upwelling events off New Jersey. So pretty different conditions compared to the previous couple of years. So to kind of summarize this report, what we're seeing here, I think, is pretty interesting, that it's possible to both meet a lot of individual stock objectives, but still have potentially worrying indicators of ecosystem level management objectives. So we're seeing pretty good stock status, but declining seafood production, historically low revenue, declining range of recreational opportunities, and a lot of community level revenue with high to very high climate vulnerability. We're seeing changes in species distribution and timing and productivity, and pretty variable ocean conditions year to year. So there's some instability out there. I think the discussion that Brandon wanted to have was maybe thinking about some of these objectives and whether the list is complete. Are there reference points or desired states that you would like us to sort of aim these indicators towards? Is the stability objective addressing council needs, and what types of forecasts might be useful? But before we do that, I want to really quickly acknowledge the many, many people who contribute to this report from over 20 institutions. We could not do this without them. So thank you to all of you who have contributed now and in the past. And the very last slide here, which everyone will have access to, links to some of the online resources and references. But Brandon, I can go back to discussion or take home or take whatever questions the council have. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a lot of information in a very short amount of time. You can take a drink of water now because I think you probably need it. Any questions or comments? Any feedback to give, Sarah? Michelle DeVault.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Sarah. Again, I think masterclass and presentation is what's been said before, and I think I'll just echo it again this year. I did have one quick question. I'm like the climate vulnerability graph, the one that goes only to 2021. Is it possible for you to bring that one up? That's the one that has like that jump in.
The one with the landings or the revenue?
The landings.
Yeah.
It's the one that has a jump at the end of 2021.
Yeah, let me grab that. That is this one?
Yes, that's the one. And help walk me through that particular indicator again, and like why we might expect to see a jump in that vulnerability even though landings are going down. I'm assuming it's because there's maybe just a greater proportion of climate sensitive species in the landings even though they are shrinking. Is that?
That's absolutely right. Yep, you nailed it. So basically it's a little confusing to put them next to each other, but yes, the climate vulnerability has to do with the proportion of species in each of those vulnerability bins, basically. So it's more saying of the landings that you do have, even though the landings are coming down, what proportion is high or moderate or low climate vulnerability. So yes, the increase there means that even though landings maybe are decreasing, a higher proportion of those landings are from climate vulnerable species.
Thank you very much. And then I guess maybe just like we're thinking about some of the discussion at the SSC when you presented this, and that I was able to catch it. And I think we may get into this a little bit more with the next agenda item, but there's so much rich information in here, especially in all of these graphs. I'm just thinking about how best to try to bring this information to the fishing community. We have very active, involved advisory panels, and I don't know if Brandon and other staff have talked about trying to maybe pull some of these graphs into our fishery information documents. I mean, I know we've talked about that through the EAFM risk assessment process and trying to, get this information out there more. But I think especially some of the environmental indicators would be really valuable for people who are out on the water, every day, many days, because I think it would help them to bring forward some of the observations that, Sarah, you mentioned that you all have solicited. So thank you.
Anything else for Sarah? Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. I may have missed it, and I may be asking a question that doesn't necessarily apply to this work, but I'm curious about what you presented as it related to the timing of spawning. It's something that we talk a lot about in Maryland on another species that I won't mention here this afternoon. But I'm wondering if there's a way in the future, so the discussion is, okay, if spawning is occurring at a past, is there something that's occurring because of that new timing that's causing problems in reproduction and the success of the spawn? And I wonder if there's anywhere to try to find a connection there, as a vulnerability to climate change. If timing is affecting the spawners, it very likely will have some impact on the recruits. And it piqued my interest, and I thought I'd ask the question to see if maybe there's some kind of connection we can make there, if it isn't already done.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent insight. And I think in some of the individual stock assessments, especially the research track assessments, I think those types of questions are being looked at, maybe not necessarily spawning timing, although the one I'm most familiar with, because I was just in it, was for Atlantic herring. And we did have information on spawning timing, as well as recruitment, as well as the food that the recruits eat and the temperature of their habitat and things like that. So that type of analysis is definitely being looked at for individual species where there's a lot of information. And I think, yeah, we'd be happy to follow up on sort of broader analyses like that. Welcome discussing that with the council to figure out what might be some priorities to try to compare here, because we do have also the fish productivity indicators that maybe could link up with some of these. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Seeing no more hands and nobody online. Thank you very much, Sarah, but you're not off the hook yet. We're going to keep you for another hour. Let's move on to the 2025 ecosystem approach to fisheries management, EAFM. The council will review the 2025 EAFM risk assessment summary report. And for that, we're going to have Brandon Muffley, Sarah Gacious, Garrett Piper, and Matt Rieslick. Brandon, are you going to start it off?
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Stephen just got the presentation up. So thank you. Yeah, we're going to step through the summary of the 2025 EAFM risk assessment. Sarah had covered a number of the indicators in the State of the Ecosystem report, and hopefully you'll be able to take away that the State of the Ecosystem report and our risk assessment are certainly highly connected and linked. We share a lot of information between these two documents, and the folks that are working behind the scenes sharing information. So they're both informing each other as we develop them together. So just a quick sense of what I plan to cover. I have just a couple of slides on a quick background in regards to the risk assessment. We'll cover some of the new and updated risk elements that we worked on between December and the spring. We'll review the risk changes from the 2024 report to 2025. And then just some future plans and priorities. And I put up there on those two figures on the right-hand side there, just to remind you that our risk assessment is connected to our EAFM guidance document, and that risk assessment is sort of the first step in our longer sort of process of how we step through and integrate ecosystem information into our management process. So a quick review, if you all remember, we've been working on risk assessment stuff for quite a bit the last couple of years, and we completed our comprehensive review in 2023. And one of the decisions that the council decided to come out of that with was that we were going to make the document more flexible and adaptive going forward, so that it was reflective of changing risks and new information as it became available. We'd be able to integrate that into our risk assessment going forward. And we could make those improvements and add that to the risk assessment without doing a whole nother comprehensive review. We could do that on an annual basis. By working with the Ecosystem and Ocean Planning Committee and the AP, we would present that information to them. We would get their feedback, and then we could integrate that into a new document going forward. So we wouldn't have to go through that sort of really comprehensive review that we did in 2023. We continue to make improvements going forward. So last year, we took all of that work out of the comprehensive review, began to update the risk assessment, given all of that feedback. And then we continued to work with the EOP throughout 2024 on some of those risk elements and indicators that needed additional work coming out of the comprehensive review. And so you all saw the final report at your December council meeting. So a lot of the details are in that report that was included as background material if you wanted to refresh your memory there. We have 28 different risk elements that we're looking at that cover ecological, economic, social, and management issues. And again, some of the indicators that we were working on in 2024, we didn't have quite ready for the 2025 for the 2024 report, and worked to include them for this one. Okay. So if maybe you noticed, the 2025 report is not a full report. We went from a 54-page document down to a very short 33-page document for yourself this year for the risk assessment. And so we were really, the details of many of the risk elements are in the full report. So all of the definitions and the indicators and all that information are in the full report from your December meeting. And this was more of a summary, or tried to make it more of a summary, really capturing the changes that we saw from 2024 to 2025, utilizing the new information that we had available. A lot of it coming from the State of the Ecosystem report, or new information that we were pulling in. We were mostly pulling data in through 2023. So we've updated all of the indicators as appropriate. So if we already had all the data in there, we didn't update anything. But if we had new information, all of the indicators were updated, and we updated all of the risk rankings and created a new summary table. And then also in the risk assessment report for this year, we have detailed information on 5 different risk elements where we updated a number of the indicators, and we'll step through those. And so those 5 are there, and we'll step through what we updated in detail for those 5 risk elements. And so really for today, we'll review the risk assessment report. The EOP committee and AP met on March 20th and reviewed the draft report, and we'll step through the committee and AP's recommendations as we go through the presentation this afternoon. We'll review the priorities and improvements that we've been thinking about for the 2026 report. And then if the council has any feedback on the risk assessment report itself, the future plans that we're thinking of, and where we may integrate this work into future council applications. And so we'll get into those 5 risk elements where we've spent some time in updating the indicators for those risk elements. First ones are associated in the ecological risk elements, and they are all associated with offshore habitat. And we've never had indicators for this particular element before, so this is sort of brand new stuff. And I'm going to turn it over to Max, we came on board at the end of last year. Sarah and Garrett were able to bring him on board, and he's been working with us on developing some of the indicators, and he spent some time working on the offshore habitat indicators. So I'm going to let him take these next few slides over.
All right, thanks for that introduction. Brandon, can you hear me?
Yep, you sound good, Max.
Great, thanks. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for that introduction. I'll jump right in. So we have refined the offshore habitat risk element based on feedback from the Ecosystem and Ocean Planning Committee and Advisory Panel. The offshore habitat element describes all habitat outside of the estuary and beyond the immediate coastal or nearshore areas. We are no longer including impacts of offshore wind development in this description to avoid double counting those concerns in the risk assessment. The indicators and criteria I will be presenting today were informed by species-specific ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles, or ESPs, for bluefish, black sea bass, and golden tilefish. Next slide, please. An ESP was developed for bluefish in 2022. Through a collaborative effort with the Bluefish Working Group, several indicators were selected for development. 21 indicators from the ESP are relevant to offshore habitat and are included in our report. These indicators focus on distribution, climate, and natural mortality. Distribution indicators assessed shifts in the center of gravity of 3 different size classes of bluefish and were generated using a VAST model from NIMP's bottom trawl data. Changes in bluefish distribution could inform state quotas, impact location and timing of spawning, and impact the location of capture. The climate indicators tracked changes in thermal conditions as a proxy for spatiotemporal changes in availability of suitable spawning habitat, as well as wind conditions as a proxy for movement of early life history stages. Changes in climate indicators could impact spawning and recruitment. The natural mortality indicators considered shortfin mako shark biomass to BMSY ratio from the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna's stock assessment as a proxy for predator biomass, and spring and fall body condition of 3 different size classes of bluefish as a proxy of susceptibility to predation and disease. A mix in indicator trends results in a moderate high ranking for this element. Climate indicators suggest a mix of positive and negative impacts on spawning season length and recruitment. Distribution indicators suggest a negative impact to optimal yield as centers of gravity for medium and large bluefish are moving northeast. Natural mortality indicators suggest a positive impact on optimal yield as mako shark biomass declines and large bluefish spring condition increases. Of the developed indicators, the climate indicators were found to have the strongest correlation with the portion of bluefish life history they were designed to describe, and were therefore weighted more heavily than the distribution or natural mortality indicators when making the risk assessment. Next slide, please. Ecosystem considerations and indicator development for black sea bass were published in 2024. 2 indicators were developed for this report. Winter bottom temperature as a proxy of overwinter survival, and winter shelf water volume as a proxy of overwinter mixing between subregions. Black sea bass have a lower thermal tolerance of 6 degrees Celsius. A winter mean bottom temperature near or trending toward this limit would have a negative impact on optimal yield. It has been hypothesized that years with winter shelf water volume greater than 4,000 kilometers cubed have increased risk of northern black sea bass migrating south and being misattributed to the southern region via removals or spring trawl captures. For both indicators, data came from the hydrographic database maintained by the Northeast Fisheries Science Center Oceans Branch, and winter was defined as February and March. January was excluded due to low in situ data coverage. Mean winter bottom temperature had a positive trend over the time series, and mean winter shelf water volume had no trend, with the majority of years and the terminal 2 years in this time series falling below the theorized threshold. Neither indicator suggested a negative impact on optimal yields, resulting in a low risk ranking for this element. Next slide, please. An ESP was developed for golden tilefish in 2024. Of the indicators selected for development in this ESP process, 10 indicators are relevant to offshore habitat. Those indicators pertain to habitat condition and physical oceanography. There was an effort to align the indicators of this ESP with the state of the ecosystem products where possible, so some of the indicators will look familiar from that report. Habitat condition indicators assess the cold pool index, cold pool spatial extent index, cold pool persistence index, and the mean bottom temperature and salinity in trawl survey stat areas where golden tilefish have been captured. These indicators were compared to thermal and salinity thresholds from the literature to assess any potential impacts to optimal yield. The cold pool index indicators are generated from bias-corrected ROMS and GLORIES data. Bottom temperature and salinity indicators were generated from GLORIES data. Physical oceanography indicators assess the sea surface temperature, Gulf Stream index, and shelf water volume, temperature, and salinity. Sea surface temperature was developed as a proxy for water mass movement, which may cause displacement or mortality of eggs and larvae. Gulf Stream index was a proxy for changes in availability of suitable habitat. Shelf water volume, temperature, and salinity were compared to golden tilefish tolerance thresholds identified in the literature. 6 of the 10 indicators had significant trends, all of which suggested positive impacts for golden tilefish optimal yield, resulting in a low risk ranking for this element. More information on all the offshore habitat indicators for these 3 species can be found in our report, and the individual ESPs also include discussions of why these indicators were chosen over other candidate indicators. Next slide, please. We presented the new offshore habitat risk indicators to the Ecosystem and Ocean Planning Committee and Advisory Panel, as well as the Scientific and Statistical Committee last month. Based on their feedback, we made a few edits to some of the indicator plots to improve interpretability. Some of the feedback we received could not be addressed in time for this year's report, but will guide our efforts moving forward. These include increasing the number of species we can evaluate by considering indicators from Research Track Term of Reference 1 reports in addition to future ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles, and developing indicators to address potential risks from sand mining. And that's the last slide I had on this element. I'll pass it back to Brandon. Thank you all for your attention, and I'd appreciate any questions or feedback, which I think we're taking at the end of the presentation today.
Great, thanks, Max. Max, really great stuff. And so I'm going to step through the rest of these. This is one of our economic ones. This is commercial value. Sarah had touched upon this quite a bit within the State of the Ecosystem report. And so we're bringing this one up. If you recall, that black line there is total revenue for all commercial landings within the Mid-Atlantic. And that used to have a long-term declining trend when it was one of the sort of arcing trend lines associated with it. But since we don't utilize that type of analyses anymore, the long-term trend, the significance of that went away. And technically that would result in, since there's no trend in either of those 2 time series, that would technically be a low risk level. But looking at that figure, and the last 3 years are the 3 lowest revenues in the entire time series, you can see that there is something going on within this, within revenue within the Mid-Atlantic. And so even though it wasn't a statistically significant trend, the group still felt that it did still deserve a moderate high risk, that things are declining within the Mid-Atlantic. Both of those 2023 are the lowest in the time series for both of those figures. And so there is a slight modification to how we did that, not using the statistical significance anymore, but keeping that at a moderate high risk. And Sarah had also touched upon this risk element is on commercial value, but we're using revenue currently as our indicators. We're really trying to work towards getting towards what profits are looking like. And so Garrett and other folks at the Science Center have really been digging into this. We presented some initial information to the SSC last month. We're actually meeting next week. The economic subgroup and the ecosystem subgroup are meeting next week to dive into these other indicators to see if we can get a better handle on commercial profits. And so we'll bring indicators back to you all next year that may get us at that profit issue versus just revenue information. And so the EOP saw all of that. They supported the changes to the risk rankings, even though it wasn't a significant trend anymore. They supported the risk ranking that we came out of that, and they certainly supported the SSC review and the development of the profits indicators instead of just revenue information. And then looking at the management ones, we have 3 of them here. We continue to make progress, I think, on offshore wind. This first one is in regards to biological. On some of the areas that we worked on, those are what you can see in red. And so this is a big thanks to Tori. Tori and I have had lots of phone calls and discussions about how we continue to analyze this information to support this risk element. So previously we just used presence and absence information out of the trawl survey. And so instead of just utilizing that, we are now utilizing total abundance information out of the trawl survey and looking at 2 different time periods and looking at the spatial overlap of total abundance of all of the species on the trawl survey in wind lease areas versus outside the wind lease areas. And the first time we were able to do this, we did not include the clam dredge survey, so we didn't have any risk rankings for our clam species. So Tori was able to dig up all of the raw clam survey information, and now we have able to do the analyses for clams. Julia had corrected me when I presented in December that I was using incorrect terminology in regards to the spatial scale that we're actually looking at all of this wind energy information. So previously I was framing it as we were looking at the wind energy areas. We're actually looking at a slightly smaller scale than that, looking at the wind lease areas. And so all of that language has been updated in this report. And the EOP committee and AP also suggested that we have a weighted spatial overlap as well to consider the different development phases of all of the offshore wind areas. And so they thought that the weighting that we were applying to the planning development phase was probably too low, that there are a number of impacts that are taking place during the planning phase. So we have a higher weighting for that. And so we reran all of those calculations. That actually does change a number of risk rankings for a number of our species, and I've highlighted those there. So we finally have risk rankings for ocean quahog and surf clam. So it's a low to moderate ranking for ocean quahog, a moderate high ranking for surf clam. So you are seeing an increasing amount of spatial overlap between the 2 different time periods we are looking at for our clams. Black sea bass. Similarly, it was a low moderate risk the last time we did this. Now utilizing the abundance information, we are seeing a higher spatial overlap for black sea bass. Same thing for butterfish, for ilex squid, and for dogfish. So we are seeing more overlap with the wind lease areas utilizing the abundance information. So I think that was a good call. We have more robust information to look at now to get a better sense of what the actual spatial overlap might be. This was a little bit more straightforward. This is our other offshore wind risk element. This is looking at fishery access and science. Not a whole lot had changed here. I was already using data through 2023 when looking at the revenue that's coming out of the wind energy areas. But again, Tori was able to grab all of the clam dredge survey information. So now we finally have rankings for our 2 clam species. And so that shows up here. So we have low risk for ocean quahog. There's not much overlap, and there's not much revenue that's coming out of the wind energy area, wind lease areas for ocean quahog. But as you saw in Sarah's presentation, there is quite a bit of of revenue that's coming out of the wind lease areas for surf clams. So that's a moderate high risk. All of the other rankings stayed the same as they were in the 2024 report. And then finally, on other ocean activities, so this is everything that may be taking place out in the offshore environment, except for offshore wind, that may be displacing where fishing activities take place. And last year, the EOP committee and AP suggested we think about additional areas that might be restricting access. So we expanded our shipping lanes. Now we have shipping fairways to encompass more of those shipping channels that are taking place. We do have restricted danger areas. So those are associated with military activities that might be taking place. And we also included artificial reefs. While the spatial extent of those is fairly small, we thought it would be good because they do restrict the types of access that may be taking place, particularly on the commercial side. So we included those now in our spatial overlap calculations. And everything, so most things stayed the same, even though we added those things. The spatial overlap didn't change dramatically, and the rankings still remain low in regards to, there is relatively low spatial overlap with limited impact to fishery prosecution. So when the committee looked at all of this, they had suggested adding some additional language within our description of our offshore wind risk elements regarding the recent uncertainties in regards to how much development may or may not take place over the next few years in regards to offshore wind and what those actual impacts may be. So that language has been added into the new report. And they didn't have any specific long-term recommendations. We have some additional thoughts in terms of where we may go with the offshore wind indicators and some additional development there. They were supportive of that, and they had some other ideas for what we might want to consider as we develop those offshore wind indicators. And then just to go through those risk rankings that changed from 2024 to 2025. So we have a mixture of some of them, you'll see decreased risk, and we'll put a blue arrow next to those where you saw a decreased risk for some of our elements, and a purple arrow next to those that we saw an increased risk. So for stock assessment performance, golden tilefish actually increased in risk. So we still do have a stock assessment that passed peer review. It's now in WAM in a state space model. But so even though we have a good stock assessment, it is very sensitive to the data that's in there. So depending on how you apply the data and what data gets used, you could come out with some different results within our golden tilefish assessment. So that risk ranking moved from low to low moderate, given the new assessment that we have. Golden tilefish, Sarah had also pointed this out. We are, for fishery status, we are now overfishing in the terminal year for golden tilefish. So that comes out as the highest risk for golden tilefish for the F status. And the most recent spiny dogfish assessment that we have, that actually changed. We now are at the lowest risk for spiny dogfish. Overfishing is not occurring there. So we had those two changes. For commercial resilience, we have a number of commercial resilience risk elements. This is in regards to revenue diversity. Here, risk went down. Sarah had pointed this out in the State of the Ecosystem report. 2023 was one of the, looks like it's probably the second highest revenue diversity in the time series. We used to have a significant long-term decline. We do not have that anymore, given some of the most recent data points, particularly 2023. And since we don't have a trend anymore, we now have low risk for this particular risk element. This is another one of our commercial resilience. This is regarding fleet diversity. Previously, there were no long-term trends associated with the two different with the indicators that we have for this risk element, but now we do have a long-term declining trend for what is that for? Oh, for the count in regards to number of permits in fleet diversity in the Mid-Atlantic. So now we have a significant decline. And so now we have moderate high risk associated with this risk element. For fishing mortality control, so this is a rolling 5-year look at total catch relative to the ABC or the ACL. So for this report, we dropped 2018 and added 2023, and that gave us some slightly different results. So summer flounder actually moved to lower risk. The commercial summer flounder is now is low risk. And all of the other ones there in purple, by adding an additional year of data, we didn't see some overages over the last 5 years for all of those species. So they all moved up one risk ranking category, given some recent overages that we've had for all of those species. In regards to discards, a fair number of things are happening within tilefish. You saw on the previous slide, both golden commercial and recreational blue line tilefish risks increased. In regards to overages, we're seeing increasing discards in blue line tilefish commercially, particularly as we apply the CAMS information. They're still relatively low overall, but we are seeing some increasing discards, and they're becoming more variable over time. So that risk increased from low to low moderate now. And so you take all of that information and we put together our traffic light summary tables here at the end. And so this time I actually counted through all of those blocks to get a sense of where we are. So if you look at all of those, 72.5% of all of those risk rankings that we have are in the low to low moderate. So most things are in pretty good shape. I would say that, you know, when you compare it to the 2024 report, we have fewer number in the low or low moderate. So we are seeing a little bit more risk compared to our 2024 report. And you look at distribution shifts, regulatory complexity, discards, and you look at all of our ecosystem risk elements, many of those are generally in our higher risk categories. So those are some of the areas that maybe we would want to focus in on what might be going on within those particular risk elements or particular fisheries that may be driving some of that higher risk that's taking place. Last couple of slides. So just where are we going with the future risk assessment reports? All right, so this is where we as staff have been thinking, Science Center staff and council staff thinking, and where we want to be focusing for 2026. I'm not going to step through all of these, but we have a number of different number of elements that we're thinking about where we want to make some improvements, mostly on the indicator development, but some of it is on the risk criteria that we are thinking about. So there are a number of areas there. We presented this to the EOP. They were in support of these priorities and areas of focusing for the 2026 report. And where do we want to keep working on this? So we do have an IRA project that was approved by NOAA Fisheries that's looking at operationalizing these ecosystem and habitat indicators and where we can integrate that into the management process. And so this would really be looking at all of the indicators that we have in our risk assessment, in the state of the ecosystem report, in our ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles, all of the indicators that may be out there, the information that's available, and really digging into those and what are their priorities that we want to be focusing in on that we can tease out some of these and where can we integrate those indicators within the management process. And so we're developing an RFP right now that we hope to get out onto the streets relatively soon for looking for contractors to help us work on this. So it's going to be something we're going to be actively engaged with the council and scientists and stakeholders to really dig into these indicators and what are those priorities and where we can integrate them into management. So stay tuned on that. And this gets to Dr. Duvall's question and point. We're trying to think about where we can integrate this information into other council documents. So, you know, we've been thinking, you know, as staff that in a lot of circumstances that if a summer flounder fisherman isn't going to be looking at state of the ecosystem reports or our risk assessment for some of the climate information that may be impacting their summer flounder fishery, but they may look at some of our very specific summer flounder documents, our fishery information documents, and when we develop our fishery performance reports with the advisory panel, if we can present this information to them and get feedback on what they're seeing. Here are the indicators we have. Are they seeing some of these similar trends? And so we're working on thinking about what indicators and information we want to put into our fishery info docs and our fishery performance reports. We met with the Science Center a few weeks ago to talk about socioeconomic indicators and developing those. And tech staff are going to be working this year to sort of tease out what information we think we would want to put into these documents, what kind of questions we want to ask from the AP to get useful feedback from them in regards to ecosystem information that may be happening out on the water. So we're targeting our 2026 documents will have some sort of either standardized or some sort of common set of indicators or information that we're going to put into our documents for next year. So hopefully that'll start getting some targeted feedback and targeted outreach in regards to this information. So last slide. There's no specific action needed from the council today. Again, these are just updates for you all to get a sense of what's going on in the environment for all of our managed species and where the risk may be changing. So this is for you to kind of be thinking about as you move through the rest of your year. You have all of this ecosystem information in front of you. But if you have any feedback in regards to the 2025 report, particularly any of those new risk elements that we worked on, that we went into detail into this presentation, the overall report, do you support the EOP recommendations that we stepped through today? And the improvements that we're thinking about for 2026. And then just really you all thinking about, is this report providing the information you wanted it to provide when we developed the risk assessment, when we started the EAFM guidance document back in 2016? So is this giving you the intended information? Is it of value to the council? So just some food for thought. Any feedback on any of those things or any discussion? I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Brandon. Any questions or comments for Brandon or Max? Jim Gilmore.
Thanks, Chairman. Brandon, it's more of a comment because when I was reading through this, hang on a second. Sorry. When I was reading through this, it seemed to be a whole report about what's happening now in the environment versus what was happening 10, 15 years ago. And then we look at the way we do management, and a lot of the management is really still 10 to 15 years old. And there was some recommendations. There was a subsequent report or a supporting document that was from one of the environmental organizations, and it was getting to the issue about allocations. And, something near and dear to New York's heart, whatever, that we recognized maybe over a decade ago that the distribution of things were changing. But the minute we said, let's reallocate, it was like, a four-letter word. We never got anywhere with it. And the one supporting document said, we can't do this anymore. We got to look at, because of the things that are moving so frequently and changing, that we really need to start looking at a different way to manage. So we've been doing these baby steps, percent change approach. We're going to be talking about, changes to that, but still it's like these little baby steps. But so the term that it kept jumping out, I saw regime shift in terms of what the previous report talked about. It's kind of like we need a regime shift in the way we're managing to keep up with the way the fisheries are changing. So again, it's just a comment at this point, but back to your point that, well, the fishermen don't see these reports. They actually just look at how we're doing the management. And if there's some way that can be at least an educational thing to say, the stocks, things are changing dramatically, but our management is like on a geologic scale, it's going along at a very slow clip. So for what it's worth, that was really what jumped out of all the reports I reviewed. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. That's really helpful. And I I think it gets to a little bit, at least in my mind, in regards to where we may want to take that IRA project. And so if we say we want to think about allocations in a broader sense, right? What kind of ecosystem information would we want to have, or indicators could we develop to support future allocation decisions, right? If we think we want to tie allocations to some sort of climate information or stock distribution information, what kind of information would you want to see as managers around the table to help inform decisions in regards to allocations or sector separation? Are there pieces of information that we can pull out of here that can be different or make a more informed decision from a climate and ecosystem perspective? So that's what I take out of your comment, and I'm hoping we're going to try to develop those indicators to be much more direct to inform the decisions that you all are thinking about.
Mike Luisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for the presentation. Brandon, if you could go back to, maybe you may not have to go back to the slide. You brought up the commercial revenue, and that was something that you guys, and I'm glad that you presented it in the way that you did. There is no trend showing, although it's the last 10 years looks pretty awful. And it really is troubling to me that the revenue has dropped as it has, over the last decade. And I'd like, maybe this isn't, maybe for some folks around the table, how come it's so bad? And I keep thinking, there was the one thing from what the presentation you just went over, Brandon, that really jumped out at me. If we're supposed to be looking at this information and using it as an indicator of something, and then it is our job as a council to engage in it, I would say that we have failed in the last 10 years. If this decline, it's not even a slow decline in revenue over 10 years. It's a complete fall off the edge of the earth almost. And it just troubles me that we're looking at what we're looking at there, and I don't know what we can do about it. I don't know what the council can do to help to get the industry back to the time period prior to 2015, 2016. I don't know what to do, but if this is supposed to be an indicator of something and we're watching it happen, we should be thinking about if there's something this council can do to engage, to try to help. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mike. That's really the whole intent of the risk assessment, right? Is to flag where things maybe we want to take a deeper dive into this particular issue, or maybe some of the broader economic sort of social things that may be going on. That's why I thought Sarah's, one of her slides at the end where she was trying to encapsulate everything that was in the State of the Ecosystem report. In general, the council's meeting its very species-specific management objectives, right? Our stocks are generally doing pretty well. Our catch limits have been fairly stable, but like you said, revenue's dropping off of a cliff. Our landings are getting towards all-time, something is going on within the system. And so that's exactly the point of this. And so if that's an area that council in general may want to, as we go through the loop, the next phase would be, okay, we have this risk assessment. These are the areas maybe the council is seeing some flags that we want to dive into a little bit more. That's the next phase to me would be, all right, let's dive into these particular issues. I would say that I think some of the work that Garrett and other folks at the center and the SSC are going to be working on is digging into teasing out revenue and getting into the profits a little bit more and trying to understand that information a little bit better. May give us maybe it gives us the same picture, but it may give us things at least a little bit a different view of what might be going on here. But yeah, your point's well taken. I think is the point of the risk assessment is to flag these kinds of things for you all.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. And I did see that you had it in your it was in the list of things that you were going to dig into. And I very much would like to have, take a hard look at that commercial revenue indicator and understand it a little bit more. Even if there's limited actions a council can take in the future to help it, to understand it more thoroughly would definitely be a plus for me. Thanks.
Michelle Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to Brandon and Sarah and Garrett. I mean, huge thanks overall, just the state of the ecosystem report for the small village it takes to put that together, and just, how interconnected that is with our EAFM risk assessment. And, big shout out to all the committee members and all the advisory panel members who really dug into this as we, work to complete this review and get this done. I guess I agree with everything that's been said about the revenue indicator, and I think the SSC had some suggestions there as well. I'm assuming that Dr. Regal will talk through those when he gives his report later this week. But one question I had about the fishing mortality control risk ranking, and is it just that there is a change during that 5-year assessment period, or is it the magnitude of the change? So in the text of the report there, it notes that, the scup fishery had been below the ACL by 28% on average, but that in 2023, the ACL was exceeded by nearly 4%. So, and also notes, some minor overages in, commercial spiny dogfish and commercial bluefish. And so is it just that there is an overage no matter how large or small, or is the magnitude of that taken into account?
It's intended to be both, right? So we are not only looking at, so I think if you had one overage, but I'm just making up an example, was a 50% overage, but there was only one in those 5 years, that could tell you something different in regards to how much control we may or may not have versus one overage that was 5% over, right? So that would come out as a different risk ranking on this table, because it's not just the number, it is also the magnitude of those overages. So we are trying to account for both of those factors as we put together the risk ranking.
And just I think another comment, so appreciate that answer, thank you. And then I think, in thinking about moving forward, as you all as staff discuss how best to also weave this information into the management process, I think, and this is probably more relevant to the state of the ecosystem report, but since that is so directly linked with our risk assessment, I think, temperature forecasts would be super helpful. I'm thinking, and providing that as part of our fishery information documents. I mean, multiple advisory panels when going through these fishery information documents and talking about how the fisheries have performed over the year. It's not just markets, but also those environmental drivers as well are very important. And so I think maybe having those forecasts could be really helpful in terms of getting a better sense from the folks who are out on the water, what they are expecting to see based on these forecasts. And that could also be a flag for us. I would also, and I know that we provide revenue information, for each of the different species in those fishery information documents, but, perhaps this large overarching graph could also be included as well, because I think that also provides some context. I don't know, just a few things to think about as y'all consider how best to move forward with this. And then when Jim mentioned, regime shift, and I was also thinking about this when Sarah was talking, how and thinking about the terms of reference for the projections research track, one of which is establish procedures for determining when to incorporate ecosystem drivers into projections. I think all of this whole big ball of wax is going to be really important to that term of reference, regime shift, and how do we tackle that in our projections. And and some of the other ecosystem drivers that have been reviewed here today. So, I mean, I fully expect that, staff from the Science Center who are working on all of this will be active participants in that research track assessment. But I think understanding more how and when a regime shift is defined and how are we going to incorporate that into future forecasts of catch levels. Thanks. I hope that made sense.
Any more comments or questions around the table? Peter?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Everybody, excuse me, my allergies decided to peak today, so I am having struggle today. When you talk about the revenue decreasing, I look at the fisheries that are decreasing. Look at the mackerel fishery. You know how much revenue came from the mackerel fishery? I mean, we've got plants in Cape May that are shut down because there's no fish coming across their decks. The herring fishery, look at scallop fishery. Scallop fishery was, almost 60 million pounds 6 years ago. We're going to be lucky to catch 18 million pounds this year because that's what's available. So when you look at the revenue decline, I think you could almost go by species to see what the decline has been. And there's kind of an answer there. I mean, those volumes of mackerel that used to come in, I worked on a boat we carried 200 tons of mackerel at a time. That fishery is just not there anymore. So when you look at revenue decline, I think you should maybe take a few of the fisheries and look at their declines over years, that not only their landing declines, but their revenue declines, and see how they pair up. But that's kind of the answer that I have in my head for why the revenue decline is so big. Might be wrong, but
Comments from the audience? Bonnie Brady?
Hi, Bonnie Brady, Long Island Commercial Fishing Association. Brandon, I'm curious specifically regarding that subcommittee meeting on commercial and profits as to when that's being held. And I honestly think with the discussion, I think 2015 was the year it went up for 2016. I know squid was a really good year that year, but specifically, at least talking about Long Island, there was pretty much a large precipitous drop after COVID. Prices were great and then prices were gone. And a lot of it had to do too with, for New York, the fresh fish market, because restaurants closed, a lot of them, and we weren't be able to get that back. Also landings in general, I know because I was looking this over, and Montauk right now is 52nd in the nation based on 2023 dollar value, or excuse me, 2023 landings value, but they only had 9 million pounds. And 6 years ago, there were 17, 18 million pounds easy. Even more than that, landings are down in general. But I really think it's important to create a subcommittee, and this is to your point, Mike, about having commercial representatives to discuss specifically what the issues are as to why revenues are not what they are in profits, as opposed to just having a different group talk about it in a vacuum. So I'd like to know how we could go about doing that specifically with that group that you spoke about next week with you and Garrett and other people, I guess, from the ecosystem division. I'm assuming Sarah's probably listening in on that too, but I think it's really important to get the dollar values right. In the past, they have not captured all of the various reasons for why we're basically at the same vessel value for many fisheries that we've been at since 1990. And I think that's really important in the mix. Thank you.
Brandon?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we could go about it a few different ways. Yeah, so the subcommittees are meeting next week. Those subcommittees just tend to meet. There isn't any sort of formal announcement on any of those, but all of that information gets presented to the SSC. I mean, we have, and we can continue, as we've developed these indicators, we can meet with the EOP committee and AP and talk through those as the SSC sort of works with Garrett and the center. We can, I can work with leadership and Michelle to see if we wanted to have, some additional discussions about those particular profit indicators that we're thinking about developing and get specific feedback from the committee and from advisors to talk through those. I think we want to give the SSC, let them figure, it's not the full SSC, but the subgroups figure out what they want to do with those, talk through those details, present those details then to the committee and AP and get feedback where we may be right or wrong and what other information we should be looking at. And so I think we can think through how best to present that as the SSC develops them.
Megan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan Lab Fisheries. Yeah, Brandon, I appreciate the presentation because as Mike pointed out earlier, yeah, that precipitous decline is very concerning. And this is something that, has been going on for a while. And I think it is important that the council take action in ways that it can to, help maybe prevent or reverse that decline. And I would have, two suggestions for the council. The first would be, hey, on demersal species, we're working on recreational flexibility, which, will be discussed tomorrow, that at times allows the recreational sector to harvest its full ACL. I'd like to ask for that same consideration on the commercial side of the equation. If the council is going to move forward in that fashion, we would like some flexibility as well. The other thing is that, if you look at certain species that are managed by this council, we got paid more money in the 90s for certain stocks than we do now. We've lost markets over time. I can speak specifically to butterfish. When the Science Center got the stock assessment wrong for 10 years and we reduced that fishery to a bycatch fishery, we lost the Japanese market. And the Japanese market paid significantly more money than what we get now. And that doesn't account for inflation. I'm just talking the straight up dollar value. And so one of the issues, that I've talked about for a long time, maybe not to the council, but to others, is restoring the true intent of the Saltonstall-Kennedy money. If you read the Saltonstall-Kennedy Act, it says that, and I will say this could be very important coming up with potential tariffs, right? 30% of the tariffs on gross imports of seafood goes into the SK fund. The law says that 60% of that money is supposed to go to direct industry grants and directly to marketing of U.S. seafood products. The Congressional Research Service did a study on that a while back, and for my entire lifetime, that money has never been spent according to the law. Never. If you actually go into the NOAA budgets, which I have, and you read what they estimate will go into the fund, most of the time, I'd say probably about 90% of the money goes out into NOAA's general operating fund. This year, the proposed budget estimates that $377 million will go into the SK fund, and 100% of it will be taken out to go into NOAA's general operating fund. That's not what that money is for. That money is supposed to go directly to industry grants and marketing of U.S. seafood products. And if we continue to lose that money and the opportunity to market U.S. seafood products, to maybe get prices up, to maybe open new doors, we will be put at a significant disadvantage. And, I would like to request that the council consider writing a letter to the Secretary of Commerce, particularly in light of the ongoing tariffs discussion, to restore that money. And let's start marketing our U.S. seafood products and potentially reverse that decline. Thank you.
Sarah, I believe did you have an answer for Bonnie?
It was Garrett, so go ahead, Garrett.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have a direct answer. Oh, yeah, for Bonnie's in particular. Yeah, I think I would say, there's a trade-off between refining indicators at the ecosystem level and being able to delve deep into what that driving forces actually are that are getting us to where we are today. And so I think I would echo Mike Luisi in, I think the time is ripe to look at, what's actually driving what we're seeing, as opposed to kind of refining the metric at a high level of what we're seeing. We know that costs are up. We know prices are down. We know that the benthos, the surf clams, ocean quahogs, and scallops are really driving the majority of that drop. It's not managed species or species managed by the mid-Atlantic in particular that's writ large driving that. And so the council could do another kind of deliberative process like they did with the summer flounder management strategy evaluation to kind of assess, what are the most high risk issues that the council's dealing with, and what are the measures that are likely to mitigate that risk. And so just kind of keeping that trade-off between high level analysis and ability to delve deep into potential mitigating measures in mind, particularly as the scientific support for fisheries management changes in the future.
Thank you, Garrett. Julie Evans?
Yes, this is Julie Evans. I represent the East Hampton Town Fisheries Advisory Committee, which consists of commercial, recreational, and the for-hire industry. Today's information is well known to us already. I feel that we need to be including, or you need to be including, the fishermen that are the first people that see what's going on the water more in all of these items that you're talking about. And I've been doing this since 2019, and I rarely ever see any of these committees include first accounts of fishermen and their activities and their economic and social status, and as Megan was saying, promote seafood. We see this with the tariffs, and I have to applaud both Bonnie and Megan for bringing these things up. We are in a decline. The fishermen are in a decline, and they've been for a long time. My family were commercial fishermen. My family were in the for-hire business, and it was always a hard job to do. But I can't imagine trying to do that at this point in time. So if you can do anything to create some sort of committee where fishermen can be heard in a better way, because I don't think anybody's really hearing us anymore. Thanks.
Seeing no more hands. Brandon, do you have anything else? Oh, excuse me, Mike Petney.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair, and appreciate the discussion, and I apologize for not catching this earlier. And Brandon, you may have explained this, and I was personally distracted with some other things. But on that slide, the risk element for commercial value, I think one of the things we've talked about, a lot of the issues associated with the council managed species, the red line, and the decline that we've seen over the last 25, 30, 20 years in revenue. But the really precipitous, like Luisi's comment about the going off the cliff seems to be with the total. And I'm just what I missed was your explanation on what those fisheries are that are presumably not council managed, but which have seen such a significant decline over the last, 8 years.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I'm gonna phone a friend and I'm gonna go back out to Garrett, who develops it more specifically than I do. And Garrett, do you have an answer for that?
Yeah, and just while he's doing that, I mean, just noticing that, we're talking about orders of magnitude, revenue above the council managed species. So my concern is our ability to influence some of this at the scale at which this information is being reported, might not be where we want it to be.
Yep, that's a good point, Mike. And hear me? Okay. I'll just go back to, I'll clarify that the black line does have managed species. It's not Mid-Atlantic Council managed species. And that precipitous decline primarily is scallops. If you go back to the State of the Ecosystem report and look at the Bennett indicator that kind of decomposes the price and the quantity effects across the different fishery, the guilds, you'll see it's benthos. And here we're primarily talking about scallops, is that steep decline there. So it's scallops within the Mid-Atlantic that's really driving that.
Okay, thanks for that, Garrick. And I think you just answered the second part of my question, was if it's scallops, is it just scallops in mid-Atlantic ports? And so changes that we've seen in the scallop fishery over the last, 5 to 10 years, both overall in terms of, as Peter noted, the decline in available quota to the scallop fishery, but also the shifts in the distribution of where those scallops are being caught and landed, it seems to be driving this.
Any more questions or comments? Seeing none, Brandon, you good? Okay, thank you, Brandon, Sarah, Garrett, and Max. Before we get into our final agenda item, let's take a 12-minute break. We'll come back at 3:20. If everyone will find their seats, we'll get started again. Welcome back, everyone. Let's get started with our final agenda item this afternoon. Essential fish habitat 5-year review. The council will receive a 5-year essential fish habitat review, and the council can consider improving the report and submitting it to National Marine Fisheries Service, completing the required review process. Jessica and Tori, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I get started, I'd like to first thank our other EFH team members that participated in leading the work for this essential fish habitat review that you're going to be going through today. In addition to myself and Tori Kentner, we worked very closely with the New England Fishery Management Council staff, Michelle Bachman, Jennifer Couture, and Julian Garrison, as well as Chris Hake from Monmouth University, who's one of the contractors that focused on the modeling work. We also worked closely with the Fishery Management Action Team members at the Mid-Atlantic Council and the Plan Development Team members at the New England Fishery Management Council from their habitat plan development team. And a lot of those folks were pretty substantial contributors to this work. Okay. There we go. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of this required essential fish habitat 5-year review and all the supporting reports and documentation developed for it. I'm going to review results for all 9 of the review components, the recommendations that were developed for each of those components, and I'll touch on next steps regarding the Mid-Atlantic's Essential Fish Habitat Omnibus Amendment, which would apply to all species and all FMPs. And then the council can consider whether to approve the reports and findings and submit those to NIMS, which would officially complete the Essential Fish Habitat review. So why do an EFH review? Well, at the top of the list, it's required, and we're supposed to do it every 5 years. But also we know that things change. So we should take a close look at our habitat and essential fish habitat information and update that periodically. As well, the Magnuson-Stevens Act specifically notes that ignoring habitat is a risk to the sustainability of our fisheries. Most of the council's essential fish habitat designations were first developed for our fishery management plans back in 1999, following off the 1996 Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization. Each time a species is added to an FMP, you are required to address all 9 components for that species relative to EFH. We have periodically done some updates through some of the individual fishery management plans. For example, 2009 golden tilefish EFH was updated, but those individual actions focused on maps and text and didn't necessarily review all 9 of those EFH components. So this review of all the species across 9 components brings the council into compliance with all of the requirements under Magnuson to take a look at all of these FMP components. So for the review approach that we took, we developed technical reports that were prepared jointly by the Fishery Management Action Team and New England's Habitat Plan Development Team. We worked at the entire Northeast region spatial scale and worked across all of the managed species, so 28 New England Council species and 15 for Mid-Atlantic. We did this to increase capacity, work more efficiently, but also to develop more consistent methods across both New England and Mid-Atlantic Council as we try to develop improved map and text designations for all of our species. We assembled an awful lot of information to support this review. These updates were supported by work that was completed during 2017 to 2022 through the Northeast Regional Habitat Assessment, where we gathered a lot of fishery independent survey information and other environmental data sets that support the maps, modeling, and other methods that we're going to talk about today. We spent about 1.5 years working with the plan development teams in FMAT through 2023 and 2024 to develop these technical reports. We also convened a subpanel of both council's SSCs to take a closer look at the modeling and mapping methods in September 2023, and they were supportive of their use for essential fish habitat designations. So the review, we drew inspiration actually for this review from the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. So the way they do their review is to develop these supporting technical component reports, and then they create an overall EFH review summary report that provides its council with details on requirements, past work, major findings relative to each of those components. So we've structured this the same way. You've received a Mid-Atlantic EFH 5-year review summary report that touches on all of these different components. I'll note that for components number 5, cumulative effects and habitat areas of particular concern, number 8, those are only addressed in the summary report. But all of the other review components have additional, more detailed supporting documents. I'm sure you saw the 300-page attachment in the briefing materials. And then this summary report. New England has already received their report and endorsed it for their review in January. So today, we're going to briefly touch on all 9 of these, starting with the text and map designations. And the EFH review requirements require that you look at a lot of different activity impacts on EFH. So we're first going to then look at impacts of council managed fishing activities, non-MSA fishing activities, non-fishing activities, and those cumulative effects of those on habitat. Look at conservation recommendations to minimize the adverse effects of fishing on EFH, food habits information, HAPCs, and then habitat research needs at the end. So most of the supporting work occurred in 2023 and 2024. And then in 2025, we had a flurry of meetings, both in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, including our committees and our advisory panels. So we're here today considering the findings of the review. And if the council approves the review, we would finalize those documents and notify GARFO of the review results. The New England Council is also waiting for us to complete our review. And then they can also submit their final reports, which are also, many of those are final reports. And then both councils could then move forward with moving the outcomes of this review into specific management actions. For the mid, it would be an omnibus amendment. For New England, they're choosing to work through a series of smaller frameworks. Given the number of species they have to deal with, they're going to be working with them as bundles of species. So component one, EFH designation methods. As I noted, a lot of this work relied on NERA in terms of information gathering. We also drew methods for the model-based approaches and mapping from what the North Pacific Fishery Management Council had recently done for their EFH 5-year review. It was just completed in 2023, and the North Pacific Council was the first council to apply model-based approaches for their mapping and text methods for essential fish habitat designation. So if we move these approaches into our amendment, we would be the second region in the country to apply these model-based approaches. The modeling and mapping approaches drew data inputs from 2000 to 2023. So we chose a more contemporary data. We drew on more contemporary data for these approaches. Our prior designations that had been in place used data going back to the 70s and 80s in terms of survey information and other data sources. Given how quickly things are changing, we chose a shorter time block, but we had to balance having enough data to adequately model what was available. So that's why it's about a 20-year time block that we utilized. We drew from species abundance data, both inshore and offshore surveys, as well as different environmental data, remote sensing, and different information for benthic habitat. The mapping and modeling methods used species distribution models. These SDMs, I know we've talked about those before. This habitat approach used one called a community basis function model. It's actually a multi-species model, but we for the individual species, and this relates that species abundance information to the environment and other factors. And we get outputs from those models that are mapped essential fish habitat extent, footprint, or occupied habitat that we'll touch on. We combined the inshore data and these model-based approaches and a essential fish habitat map. And within the report that's been provided to you, we have a number of worked examples. So bluefish, shortfin squid, summer flounder, and red hake were our initial examples that we worked. And that Tori can show in the essential fish habitat demo application, although we have outputs that are going to go into the amendment for all of our managed species that we were able to model. So Julian from New England actually developed this really great designation methods flowchart, which is really helpful in terms of visualizing how we put information together. As I noted, we started at the top with environmental data, offshore fishery independent survey data, so like the federal surveys NEMAP, and then inshore surveys from Maine all the way through actually the South Atlantic, so CMAP data, so the entire Atlantic coast. So what the modeling did, these species distribution models, was we pulled together those offshore surveys and some select inshore trawl surveys that had the most similar types of methods into the models to develop these distribution outputs. We took the top 95th predicted density quantiles and constrained those to occupied habitat. So that was areas that had greater than a 5% encounter probability of finding that species within a specific grid cell. And so that created that occupied habitat footprint. And then we were able to take this inshore fishery independent data separately. So all those other trawls, looked at inshore occurrences, clipped those at the 5% occurrence rates, and then combined those to create the maps for those habitat footprints. Obviously, we both in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, we have some data poor species, so we've had to do some alternate data processing. We're looking at literature and other information that supports this review. And then for some of our species, so surf clams and ocean quahogs, New England scallops, and the tile fishes, we have other surveys. So it's not the trawl survey data. We have other types of survey data that's being modeled to help develop those occupied habitat footprints. So again, species distribution models, taking that observed density of species, so species information, we run it through environmental filters and environmental predictors to estimate that species niche. And then we essentially get predicted information on where we might expect that species to occur. And then we clip that information in terms of what we've defined as occupied habitat. So for our EFH footprint development, we specifically used the Center Survey, NEMAP, the Maine, New Hampshire Trawl Survey, and the Massachusetts Trawl Surveys, again, because those are most similar in terms of similar types of methods. Ideally, we'd like to incorporate all of them at some point, and it's something that we could build to going forward. It includes numerous oceanographic and bottom habitat predictors. Those are noted in the report. I'm not going to go through all those here. We also limited model predictions beyond the sampled area. So these models do allow the capability with those environmental predictors to predict well outside of where you actually have fishery independent survey information, but we chose to constrain that information. So we narrowed the footprint. So we're not really predicting much further out than what we would have observed in terms of survey information. And then again, we have a specific definition for occupied habitat. So for talking a little bit about the inshore map development and inshore surveys, I'm going to hand it off to Tori to finish out this component.
Good afternoon, everybody. So as you probably have seen this before, this is just a screenshot from the NERA Data Explorer, but you can see all of those different inshore surveys are covered there, just to give you a little more detail. So as Jessica mentioned, NEMAP's Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts went into the model, but the rest of these surveys weren't easily incorporated into that. We didn't want to lose all this valuable data. So we came up with a method to incorporate this as well. So we used the same 1 kilometer grid that was used in the model. We added all of the coastal and estuary areas to that, and then have a 3 kilometer buffer around those estuary regions. And then we have the ability to kind of turn all of those estuaries on and off if we find that species in that estuary. We are using the same time period. So we have 2000 to 2019 spring and fall data, and we're using only trawl survey, no seine data. And then species are classified by length, juvenile and adults. And then from there, we can calculate inshore occurrences. So determine frequency of the species across the different tows within each 1 kilometer grid, and then do some nearest neighbor smoothing on that, and then use the same 5% occurrences. So then what we do is we combine those two together, so inshore occurrences and model predictions, and then create our EFH footprint from that. So I'll switch over real quick to the EFH demo. And so this is available online if you want to take a look. The link is there, but
it's not sharing.
It's not sharing. Okay.
Yeah. On. There we go. Okay. There you go.
Okay, great. So on this app, you have the ability to look at each of those different models. So you can look at model encounter probability, model density. You can look at the inshore occurrences, and these are for those species that Jessica mentioned: summer flounder, adult and juvenile, red hake, bluefish. There's a whole list of species that we've used for our first demos here. So you can take a look at an individual species and life stage. And so what we did is we essentially combined our modeling with our inshore occurrences and then put a shape around that, and that creates our proposed EFH area. So those estuaries are in purple. That's the areas that are getting kind of turned on based off that orange inshore data and also the model occurrences. If you're interested, you can also look at the current EFH. So that's as the designation is now. So you can compare the two side by side. You can also look at contour lines if you're interested in depth. All of that information is available here, and it gives us a chance and also other users a chance to kind of see these, zoom in, see what the data actually looks like, what these distributions are looking like, and how we're designated EFH. Anything else? I think that's it. Back to you, Jessica.
All right, there we go. Okay, so one additional thing I'd like to note, our plan with the this demo tool is, as we move forward with the amendment process, we can load up all of our species into that demo tool and use that to help us solicit input from our advisors, from the committee members, and other experts as we refine those EFH designations. So I would look at these maps that we're initially loading in the demo as a starting point based on the information we had available, and we really want to refine them based on input as we move through the amendment process. So really, some of the key takeaways as we worked through this first component with EFH designation methods, we really think these are a lot of advances over the previous methods, improved data modeling, use of our data mapping technologies and expertise that weren't available to us back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when many of those original designations were developed. So we are recommending that these be folded into the process and into the amendment. They were really developed to improve greater connectivity and inclusivity between locations where the species are found, more contemporary time periods, and linking information across life stages. We're hoping this will streamline future updates to EFH designations. So we're building these frameworks so they can be updated and make this process easier the next time. Also working through an omnibus and working through all of this with New England, we're looking to integrate more consistency. So consistency in language, in structure, for our EFH designations across species, regions, how we talk about different habitat types, just using consistency in there, which we didn't see just working through individual FMPs one at a time. And this work really promotes collaboration with our council partners, but also with our regional and federal partners and all of these data providers that we've been working with to create these improved designations. So within the EFH designation report, there's a table that lists all of our individual species. These mapping and modeling methods are focused on juveniles and adults predominantly, not as much on the egg and larvae information, though we did take a close look at the egg and larvae information. It is less consistently available and less broadly distributed. We don't have egg and larvae information for the inshore areas. We only have it for some species. So in some cases, only certain life stages, like we might only have larvae, but not eggs for some species. So we have some recommendations for some consistency in approaches and using some proxy approaches until there are improvements to that information. But we are recommending updates for all of our council managed species. I'll note that New England Council has the lead for jointly managed dogfish, so they would have primary responsibility for EFH development, although they would be looking to use similar types of methods since we've been looking so closely and collaboratively. Recommendations on this component one. So we think the council should evaluate and potentially update text to map components for all designations for all species in this omnibus action. And we think we should continue to update and advance these methods, the species and environmental data sources, modeling approaches, continue to build improvements and continue to collaborate and share information and resources with our partners as part of this process. So that is component 1. I'm going to move into component 2 and 6, and then we'll pause after that to take some questions. Components 2 is estimating fishing impacts on essential fish habitat, and component 6 is minimizing the adverse effects of fishing on fish habitat, including EFH. We've combined these two into a single component report because they are interrelated. So for this EFH review, we provided model-based estimates of the spatial and temporal effects of fishing on seafloor habitats. It builds off of work that was developed, reviewed, and applied by both the New England Council and North Pacific Fishery Management Council. They've been dealing with fishing effects models for about a decade, and they've been working to improve those with contract support from researchers at the FAST lab at Alaska Pacific University. So the fishing effects model in this case was updated for the whole Northeast region, and it includes both Mid-Atlantic and New England gears. It includes a habitat and energy map, fishing effort information, and susceptibility and recovery parameters for habitat. And it estimates the percent of habitat disturbance in individual grid cells, and those are 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer grid cells. So the fishing effects model outputs were updated to reflect fishing activity through the end of the 2023 fishing year. The Northeast Fisheries Science Center, Garrett DePiper, who you heard from earlier, helped to develop those updates along with Andy Applegate, the New England Council, and Tori Kentner to get that model up and running. Some of the data inputs begin as early as 1996. The effort inputs into the model are swept area per trip, and they're summarized by those individual grid cells and by month. The swept area estimation methods are similar to the past work of both New England and North Pacific, so we haven't updated those overall modeling approaches for this iteration. There are reports and documentation that really go into a lot more detail about those methods that are noted in our component report. But really the refinements that were more recently made were to minimize the influence of any data outliers and to make sure that those Mid-Atlantic gear types were fully incorporated. So the effort information is generally from vessel trip reports. And this is as summarized in the CAMS database, which I'll note was quite a bear to kind of recode and retool everything to work within CAMS, but that was something that our team worked really heavily on over the last year and was able to get everything up and working and with model outputs. So there's a number of figures that are provided in your report. On the left-hand side is the mean effect of fishing across all gears. By mean effect, this is the mean across all of those individual grid squares, those 5 by 5 kilometer grid squares across the entire fishing domain, which is across that entire Northeast region. So as you can see on the left-hand side, for all gears combined, there has been a declining trend in the mean effect of fishing over time. So we're definitely lower in the most recent part of the time series compared to earlier in the time series. On the right-hand side, this is a breakout of all of the gears by gear type. The blue line on the top is the trawl gear. I'll note that there are multiple types of trawl gears that are combined in that trawl gear component, and it could include multiple FMPs. We did not break this information out by fishery management plan. Scallop and hydraulic clam dredge are the two gears that I'll note that are single FMP, single gear type in our analysis, but the others actually do have combinations of different FMPs or gear types within those. So trawl obviously has sort of the largest mean effect across this analysis, followed by scallop gear. And then the other gears that we looked at were gillnet, trap, long line, and hydraulic dredge, which are kind of hard to see because they're at the bottom of the scale. So blowing those 6 gear categories up so we can take a closer look at those, you see a general declining trend in mean effect over time for trawl, longline, gillnet, and scallop dredge. Trap and hydraulic dredge did show increasing effects over time throughout in terms of overall mean effect across the entire region. We do have still figures that are in the report itself that you can look at, but we, well, Tori, what am I saying? Tori put some GIFs together so you can actually look at the yearly effects, these mean effects over time, because these mean effects are distributed differently across the entire domain. So we've developed these for all of the individual gear types. You can see some of the closed areas, those dark triangles and squares are some of the closed areas. You see them coming and going over time and see some of those edge effects from some of those areas. So we have these and have these available. We tried really hard to figure out how to get them embedded in the PDF to share them directly, and it was quite a beast and we couldn't quite get it to work. So if folks do want to take a closer look at this, we can find a way to get these circulated in a smaller file with just the GIFs included if folks want to take a closer look at these. So we have these for scallop dredge gear. And then again, hydraulic dredge, longline gear, trap gear, and gillnet gear. So I'm not going to show all of those individually, but we've also broken out this information across all of the gears by region. So we've got those as ecological production units for Mid-Atlantic, Bight, Southern New England, Georges Bank, and Gulf of Maine. And similarly, you can look at sort of the local mean effects across time for individual years. So this is Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank, Southern New England, and Mid-Atlantic Bight. So there's a lot of information available that we were able to compile, and the team working on this, we really viewed this as a launching off point for additional analysis if it's something the council was interested in taking a closer look at or pursuing. So the recommendations to the council are to update the fishing effects analysis more routinely. Again, timing depending on available resources. One of the things we talked about was maybe it's something that can be updated like every other year. There are real benefits to updating these things routinely, including when they make changes to CAMs or other databases. It's easier to work those changes in as they go than to wait a while and then have to do it all at once. So keeping these things up and running, getting those effort data sets updated, it would be great to kind of chip away at those over time and provide that information to the council if it's interested. And then continuing to advance modeling methods. We think there's a lot of opportunity, particularly with the North Pacific Council. They are applying this fishing effects modeling, and although they have different data, there's a lot of similarities between our region and their region in terms of the types of data inputs that we're working with and the types of gears and habitats. And so we're all looking to improve these modeling approaches. So we think there would be benefit to working across the regions to update data literature, the vulnerability assessments, doing the model calculations, improving those going forward. So component 6, also addressed in the report, is minimizing adverse effects of fishing on EFH. Fortunately for us, in the last few years, the Council Coordination Committee Area-Based Management Subcommittee has done a lot of work on conservation areas and developing a database that looks at all of the different kinds of fishing gear prohibitions that are in place and associated with different areas that the councils manage. So that's a great inventory and a resource that we were able to council, and in fact, all the councils are doing relative to fishing gear, addressing the adverse effects of fishing. So that's noted in our report. So for the recommendations for the council, you could consider if, based on this information, you feel the need to take up an action to adjust any measures and fishery management plans that minimize the effects of fishing on EFH. I think I've noted before, at least to the committee, when we've talked about the essential fish habitat review, that the council's required to do a review. It doesn't necessarily require that the council take action, but all of this information is available for you to consider. So if there are things you think should be taken up, you could consider those in the omnibus EFH amendment, or consider taking these up at other points in future actions. The council could consider a more detailed evaluation of fishing effects at finer temporal scales, if you wanted to take a closer look at that. As we noted, this is a launching off point for this information, gives you a first sort of look at it at a higher level. For example, if you were interested in taking a closer look at trawls, it would be great we could break those out by the individual trawl gears, because there's multiple trawls that are associated with that, multiple FMPs that could be across one or both councils that are managing that. So we could look at things at a finer scale if that's something that the council would like to take a look at for specific actions or different kinds of measures considerations. And then also considering what other factors could be, including the offshore marine environment, and how these activities are affecting how and where fisheries are being prosecuted in space and time. And, I think some of this was brought up relative to the revenue discussion for the risk assessment. You looked at that revenue information, and which I'm sure some of that also relates to fishing effort and different activities. These are all sort of interrelated in terms of how they affect the decisions that are made relative to fishing. So that's something that council could also consider. With that, Mr. Chair, I think this would be a good spot to stop and maybe take a few questions either on the structure of the review or component 1 or 2 and 6.
Questions around the table? Seeing none?
Okay.
Continue on, Jessica.
All right. Well, we'll just keep rolling. All right. Component 3, non-Magnuson-Stevens Act fishing activities. This is something that our Fishery Management Action Team and PDT took up early on in the process about 1.5 years ago. We decided to work with some of our plan development team members who took the lead on developing a questionnaire to state agencies. We decided to focus on larger scale, generally commercial fishing that's occurring in state waters. So that's a non-MSA component activity. And we asked states if they could provide us with information on the most important fisheries that they regulated in terms of impacts to habitat. And we left it very open-ended, just asked them, it could be based on the scale of the fishery. If it was very large scale, it could be dependent on the gear. They expected that gear type would affect habitat, or there were concerns about habitat impacts because of the location of the fishery or other factors. So I just want to note that this isn't an exhaustive list of every fishing activity that occurs in state waters. The report that we developed for this was really focused on self-reporting from those state agencies on the fisheries that they identified that might be most impactful on habitat. So it was a fairly efficient process. We did have a few challenges in getting responses, and those states know who they are. So I'm not going to call any of them out, but we did in the end. It was great. We started the process early. Like I said, 1.5 years ago. So with a little bit of nudging, we got all of the information we needed, and we greatly appreciated all of the states and their staff, personnel for putting all this information together for us. Having received all that information, I do think we would consider as a team planning to refine the request for next time. It's great that we have this report now as a starting point, and information is a starting point for what we ask. But next time we may change how we do the ask, maybe include some lists of species to help structure that ask a little bit differently. And we could also potentially expand this report into other types of non-MSA fishing that could be happening within those states or could be regulated under other types of entities. So our recommendations to the council on component 3 are to continue deploying this questionnaire-based approach in partnership with the states, so long as they're willing to work with us. And then refine the questionnaire to hopefully make it easier for the state agencies to respond and to make sure that all of the fisheries of interest that may have E of H impacts are actually captured in the responses. We also could consider these other non-MSA fishing. You know, some of these aren't things that we talk about a lot because we're typically focused on MSA and EEZ fishing, but there are fisheries that are managed on federal lands by like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So we have some forage species or other species that may run into areas that are managed by these other entities or outside the MSA jurisdiction. So there are high seas permitted fisheries that occur under the High Sea Fishing Compliance Act. That's not something we normally take a look at, but it may be useful to include that, or recreational, subsistence, or other traditional indigenous fishing that doesn't meet the definition of commercial or recreational fisheries that they manage. So we could potentially build on this report in the next steps. It's just not something that we took up at this phase. And I'll just note generally for all of these different components, our FMAT and PDTs, this was the first time we did this. So we did what we could with the time and resources we had, and then hoping to make this a new iterative process that we can continue to build on and expand and improve our products. So component 4, non-fishing impacts to essential fish habitat. This report highlights prior evaluations of impacts of non-fishing activities within the region. There are some really great resources that have been developed in the past. NOAA has developed a number of technical memorandum that are really very detailed. We were not able to get into that level of detail as part of the CFH review. So what we've chosen to do with our report is use it to identify any new or emerging activities or issues related to activities that we've been tracking, describe non-fishing activities or issues that maybe the council's not that familiar with, and really try to flag for the council any new non-fishing activities that might be of concern that might warrant additional evaluation in the future. So the topics that we covered in our report were aquaculture, climate change, flood control and shoreline protection, marine carbon dioxide removal, marine debris, which also included bioplastics and microplastics, other materials that fall under that marine debris category, offshore mining of sand and other minerals, offshore wind energy, restoration strategies, and water quality, so emerging contaminants that are occurring within our region. So some of these, we do have council habitat policies that address components of these, but we tried to use this report to focus on new information that may be available relative to those, or just sort of new and emerging issues, like the marine carbon dioxide removal was more of a new sort of emerging issue that hasn't been addressed in prior technical memorandums or documents. So our recommendations to the council were for more routine check-ins to occur between NOAA, EFH consultation staff and council staff to make sure that we're staying on top of these emerging issues. Doing routine literature searches to see if we can identify new published information or literature so we can better track these issues. It's a lot easier to periodically look for this information than to have to do big digs for literature and information all at once. Continued participation of the staff in regional habitat management, science, and conservation partnerships. These really help build expertise for your habitat staff in terms of the kinds of activities that are ongoing in the region. I think you know for a lot of these habitat restoration groups or other groups that work on permitting of projects, Army Corps, USGS, EPA, those aren't folks that normally are around the council table, but they're very engaged on a lot of these non-fishing activities. So our engagement with them through these groups has been very helpful, and we recommend continuing that and considering the development of new habitat policies in the future. We didn't flag any specific topics right now for the council, but those have been valuable in terms of council staff drafting and preparing comment letters on behalf of the council on these different kinds of activities. So we think it's a useful practice for the council to develop those policies up front, so then the staff can quickly utilize those to incorporate your comments. So component 5, cumulative impacts. Cumulative impacts, this is just included as part of the summary report, so it's given a relatively short treatment within this EFH review. We deal with cumulative impacts or cumulative effects, a cumulative effects assessment for each of the actions that we submit to NOAA Fisheries for implementation. And we're required to look at the impact of any given action the council's taking with past, present, or foreseeable future actions, including any synergistic effects of all of those. So whatever our proposed project is or our proposed action, we have to look at it in the context of all of those other kinds of activities. And so our current, what I'm calling prior evaluation, but the current way we typically approach this is a very qualitative approach, considering different ecosystem components, the environment, the managed species, human communities, and protected resources. We're recommending that we could expand on those kinds of approaches, and including things like the spatial overlap analysis, similar to what was included in the risk assessment. Some of the indicator work that's being done, we could move to more quantitative or semi-quantitative approaches to this cumulative effects analysis that we're doing. And we recognize that this is a really challenging analysis to do in a meaningful way, but through the State of the Ecosystem report, the risk assessment, and all of these Inflation Reduction Act projects that are going to be developing these kinds of indicators, we could think about how we incorporate those into our documents going forward. So our recommendations for council action are to develop some of these spatial products and develop some of these quantitative indices to help us measure cumulative effects and do a better job of how we analyze our cumulative effects within our documents. And that, again, would take time, but that's something we could work on over time to really improve those. To identify and implement living documents and other resources that we could incorporate into our FMPs more easily. And to also consider other examples of cumulative impacts analysis that other groups are doing, like in offshore wind, that we could potentially fold into these types of approaches. So again, this is something that we could look at over the next few years and just sort of build from there as a potential opportunity. So component 7, we're going to go through this one, and then I think it'd be a good time to stop and take a break for questions, since we've rolled through so many components. So food habits for council managed species. The essential fish habitat regulations do require that you list the major prey species for the species in the fishery management unit and discuss the location of all of those prey species. We haven't gotten as far as the location of all of the prey species, but we've taken a pretty good crack at looking at food habits for all of our managed species and this iteration and this update for the review. And again, it's important because there's direct and indirect effects on predators, predator functional roles, prey roles within the ecosystem. You're all familiar with that. So the inputs that we considered were the Science Center's Food Web Dynamics program data. Brian Smith at the Science Center was a huge help and huge resource for providing information to us to support our analysis. We also relied on essential fish habitat source documents. While some of those are a little bit older, we currently have an Inflation Reduction Act project that just started to update all of those for the Mid-Atlantic and New England Council Managed Species. So for our next review, those will be a really great resource, updated resource for information. We relied on work in Omnibus Habitat Amendment 2 that the New England Council developed, as well as a search of more recent literature. We summarized the food habits and we looked at a proportion percent of diet by weight of prey. So for our analysis, we were able to evaluate 33 species that we had food habits data and EFH source documents for. There were some species that are not in that food habits database, so we had to rely on EFH source documents. And then some species, we lacked both food habits data and source documents on what they eat. So we had to rely on literature review for those species. So the summarized data from the center included 165 categories of prey items. And we looked at those again as a proportion of diet by weight. We averaged them across 4 grouping variables for each of the predators or managed species that we looked at. We broke those into 2 time blocks, so pre-2000 and post-2000. And again, picking similar years to what we picked to for the modeling methods, the mapping methods. We were trying to sort of look at that more contemporary data, but also have the opportunity to look back at the older data. Seasons, spring, summer, fall, and winter. Although spring and fall, we had the most information for. Geographic area, and then predator-specific size class, because size determines a lot of what's eaten. You know, little mouths can't stick big prey items in their little mouths. So we did bin some of the size categories, even though there was an extra small category, an extra large category in that data. There were a lot fewer samples in those, so we bin them. So there's an extra small category, a medium, and a large, extra large in our analysis. And we excluded prey items. Brian Smith helped us figure out how to exclude those. Those that were less than 2% by weight in the diet were excluded, and we eliminated any grouping combinations that had less than 50 stomach samples. So in terms of products, there is the food habits report, and then we developed a Shiny application to also house a lot of the information that we compiled. Within the report, to avoid it being a 1,000-page report, we really chose 2 table figure formats. The one on the left looks at prey, species, items by size category. So those extra small, small, medium, large, extra large. And so we have all of the percentages by those different prey items. And then on the right, we broke this out into 2 time blocks. So this is bluefish as an example. So the left-hand side is the 80 to 1999, right-hand side 2000 to 2022, and then fall and spring surveys. So you can look at bluefish prey items across those 2 time blocks and across those different seasons. So these are the 2 sort of slices of information that we've provided in the report in terms of tables and figures. But you'll see certain species, so like that big orange block on the left and orange bar on the right, that's loligo. So that's squid species on left or right-hand side on those. So I'm gonna hand this off to Tori right now to go ahead and demo the Shiny application, and this is the other piece that we've developed for this review. Okay, let's see. Browser, share. Oh, I gotta hide that thing. There we go. It's just loading, and then Tori can take over.
Hello again. So Julian Garrison and I worked together on this Shiny app, and our idea was that there's so much data available on these different prey interactions, predator-prey interactions. we wanted it to make it more interactive. So what you see here is the Shiny app. The link is live. It will stay available. And you can select an individual predator. So you can look at Acadian redfish, Atlantic cod, any of these predators that are in the data set are available here. And what you'll see on the figure is, like Jessica described, is the earlier time period versus the later time period. But what this app allows you to do is then have more interactions. So you can combine spring and fall together along with all the other seasons and kind of see across the entire year what's the largest proportion of prey for this species. Or if you're interested in looking at a particular region, you can select different regions. And again, those will be combined. Or if you're interested in seeing those as individual figures, you can check this box here. So aggregate across seasons or geo areas. You could select season or geo area, and then you'll see each season or geo area as its own plot. You can also add the different size classes here, and those will show up on the same figure. So it really gives you a chance to dig deep into this data set and kind of see which prey are most important to which predators. There's a few tables also here. So this shows the average proportion of weight of each species in the diet of the selected predator. So again, you can select all these different factors. So season, region, time period, size category, and this tells you the mean proportion of that prey to that predator. If you're interested in more of a prey focus, you can drop on this tab. You can actually select an individual prey species, and then you can see which predators eat that most often. So that's the number of stomachs and the frequency in the data set. Again, all these filters can be applied. Or if there's a particular predator-prey interaction you want to dig into, you can do that on this last tab. So that lets you select a single predator and a single prey, and you can see the mean or the percent of diet by weight for those two species together. If you're interested in the raw data, that's also available, and this is filtered. And then if you click the info button, you can see the size classes, the actual centimeters for each species for those different size classes. So like Jessica said, this gives you a chance to kind of dig more into those data sets, a lot more than we could include in the report.
Okay. So, Mr. Chair, I think this might be a good spot to take any questions on the components we just wrapped up with.
Do we have any questions for Jessica or Tori? Michelle?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not a question, really, just a comment. I mean, I think just hats off to you, Jessica and Tori and Michelle Bachman and the folks at the New England Council for the collaborative nature in which you did this. I think it really resulted in a suite of great products that are going to be incredibly beneficial as the council moves forward. You know, certainly the estuarine habitat, offshore habitat feeding right into the EAFM risk assessment. And I think, you know, if folks haven't had a chance to look at some of the individual reports, I think just the way that they are constructed is incredibly useful, and I'd encourage folks to poke through there. And I think the report itself is just very well laid out, very well organized, and very useful. So I certainly appreciate all of the work that has gone into, you know, this EFH review. I know it can be really hard to see like the light at the end of the tunnel when you when you start down one of these roads. And I know we have the omnibus amendment coming up, but it, you know, I think you all have done a great job of getting us through this piece of it. So thank you.
Mike Loisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not a comment, but more in the form of an apology. I felt like when Jessica was mentioning that there are some folks who she was having a difficult time getting information from. State of Maryland was one of those states. So I apologize for that. Maybe we can talk the next time we need information like that. There's probably a better way than sending it to me. I'll end it with that. But again, sorry about that, and we'll do better next time.
Anything else? Seeing none, oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, Maureen, you were hiding over there on me again.
Well, no, just following up behind Mike, New York says nothing.
Now I see no more hands, Jessica. Continue on, please.
All right, continuing on. Every time I stop, I gotta let's see. Okay. So just to close out this last component, just the recommendations goes right to the point that Michelle has made. We think council should consider how the food habits information can integrate with or inform other council and NOAA processes. We've got some examples here of places where we think that might be useful. So I think that's important for the council to consider. We did develop a lot of these products for the review, hoping they could be used in other aspects of the council or NOAA process. The council should consider how we roll out these products, share the reports, the applications. I know we've already talked to some of our comms people about how we can roll these up into our web pages, but we also need to make sure we circle back and get everything documented and get all our code and everything into repositories or secured so that we can continue to apply it. And then continuing to share resources and information with the NOAA Fisheries, the Food Web Dynamic Program. So Brian, as I noted, Brian Smith was incredibly helpful in terms of providing information. NOAA actually has their own application on their webpage, but some of the slices of information in terms of the way it shared it was a little different than what we wanted to do. So I know there's a lot of feedback that we've provided to them, and they're working to improve their application as well. So I think we're going to continue to work closely with them to figure out how to use that information, share it, and make sure that it's available. So 2 more components to get through. Component 8, habitat areas of particular concern. These are a subset of essential fish habitat, and they're identified based on ecological, functional importance, habitat sensitivity to activities that are impacting it, or rarity of habitat. The council has gone through prior evaluations for habitat areas of particular concern and utilized a diverse range of approaches. And actually around the country, there are a diverse range of approaches that have been taken and could be considered. The designation process is actually really flexible, which is helpful. The council, needs to identify their habitat area of concern, draft the designation, either the boundary or the rationale relative to those 4 components. And the councils can incorporate those actions into their fishery management plans and submit those for NOAA to review and approve that designation. So the Mid-Atlantic actually has 2 habitat areas of particular concern within our region. I'll note that these can either be based on habitat type, they can be place-based, or they can be specific to an individual species or specific to multiple species, again, quite flexible. For golden tilefish, we've actually done both habitat and place-based in terms of the same designation. So clay outcroppings or pueblo habitats in 4 canyons, Norfolk, Beach, Lydonia, and Oceanographer are defined as HAPCs for golden tilefish. And then for summer flounder, juveniles and adults, we've essentially designated submerged aquatic vegetation, whether it's native or exotic, in terms of a habitat area of particular concern designation for that species. So I'll note these are used by NOAA during their essential fish habitat consultation process. So when projects apply for federal permits, NOAA can use these to point out important habitats for our species, and these habitat area of particular concern designations add additional sort of emphasis to certain habitat types or certain areas. They are non-regulatory. The designation of a habitat area of particular concern doesn't restrict fishing or other activities. It encourages avoidance or minimization of those areas or elevates conservation concerns. They are, however, often co-designated either as habitat management areas in New England or gear restricted areas, because those are areas that have been elevated for conservation concern. So it does add some complexity to the process. So our recommendation for the council is that you could consider the addition of any HAPCs through your omnibus amendment process for a couple of reasons. One, they do add value during the EFH consultation process. And so as sites are being explored for wind energy development or other areas, we've been able to point to those kinds of habitat areas of concern that have been elevated, and NOAA is able to do that. There is some new information that we've identified as we went through the review process that could support some new HAPC designations. For example, the habitat climate vulnerability crosswalks that were developed for the Northeast Regional Habitat Assessment that crosswalked the NOAA climate vulnerability assessments with the NOAA habitat climate vulnerability assessments. So it looked at habitat vulnerability and climate vulnerability for individual species. That identified some new habitat types for specific species that are things that you could consider, or we could look at some of these modeling mapping methods that have some quantitative approaches. So those are things we think that the council could look at as part of its process. And it may be useful to take it up while you're working through your omnibus EFH amendment process. And the council is focused on a habitat-related action across all its species. So component 9, essential fish habitat-related research needs. So this report that we've developed on the component, it's just a brief description. It provides a brief description of any existing research planning documents and research needs inventories that we have throughout the Northeast. And there's a number of those. We have research needs, including habitat or ecosystem needs in a bunch of different places. For this report, we chose to list some new ideas for research related to EFH that we identified during the EFH review. So I just want to note that we didn't do a comprehensive gap analysis of all the different types of research planning documents and identified gaps in terms of all the missing research. We really just focused on the EFH related needs we think that apply to the region. It's a really great list. I think it's a fantastic list, and it's such a good list that I'm not going to read it to you here today. But if you'd like to take a closer look at that, please do. But these are some of the things that we think if we want to move our essential fish habitats review forward in the next 5 years or 10 years, these are the kinds of things that we should be working on. So we do think the council could consider updating, research needs or adding to this list, or any other research needs from new and existing inventories, as the New England Council and Mid-Atlantic Council also complete the Inflation Reduction Act projects. So there's a lot of projects going related to habitat and different types of ecosystem indicators. So we think there's probably other needs that will be identified as part of that process. So those could be added to our list. So we're recommending we think about that as we move through the IRA process. Okay, so those are all 9 components and that we completed in just about an hour, which is, I think, pretty darn good. So on March 4th, we presented all 9 of these components, the summary report, and all of those supporting reports to the Ecosystem and Ocean Planning Committee and advisors. And they reviewed all that information and passed a motion to endorse the EFH technical review reports and findings and send those to the council for final approval. So you have all of those in front of you for consideration today. There were a number of comments and minor revisions that were identified during that March 4th meeting. Our EFH team went back and addressed all of those comments that both the committee and the advisors had identified. So those are all reflected in your current documents. So there were some really good revisions that were made as a result of that meeting. We also asked the committee and advisors what they thought about the process and the collaborative process that we worked through, because this is different. We normally don't work with New England Council through a big process like this. It really took a team, a small village, to do all the work, and working across both technical teams, both in New England and Mid-Atlantic. And The committee and advisors did indicate they were supportive of this process and trying to work that way in the future. So there's a great summary report from that committee meeting. It's included within your meeting materials. For today, if the council decides to approve the essential fish habitat review and approve the reports and the findings, the council could submit those results to NIMS, and then we could post and share those results in the next few weeks. Then the council, we could start the omnibus essential fish habitat amendment. The council has already initiated that amendment. You initiated it at the same time you initiated the essential fish habitat review. So you initiated both of them at the same time. So we could immediately begin work, and we already have a fishery management action team that was formed up for the EFH review amendment. So we could move right into the work phase. So the plan would be to do development work over the course of the summer, working closely with the Ecosystem and Ocean Planning Committee and Advisory Panel to develop that action. One of the great things about doing the review this way, typically when we do an amendment, you're building and developing the analyses while you're working on the amendment. A lot of the foundational work has already been done. So it should be a more rapid process where we're folding the information into an amendment and then working through refining those alternatives through the committee and advisory panel process. The plan would be to have a public hearing draft to the council in October 2025, and then we could take it out for public comment and public hearings, and then continue to refine that action, avoid that busy December council meeting that you usually have with the board, and then take our final action in February 2026. You could select your preferred habitat alternatives and submit that omnibus EFH amendment to National Marine Fisheries Service, and then they would work through their rulemaking process. So that would be potential next steps if you approve the EFH review today.
Thank you, Jessica. Questions, comments? And I believe we have, seeing no hands, Jessica, I believe you have a motion ready to go.
I do. This is a draft motion based on the committee motion. Very similar.
Yeah, was it a committee motion?
Well, the committee made a motion to approve to endorse the reports and findings and send it to you. And this is similar language, but this is a new draft motion.
Okay.
Just to be clear.
Mike Luisi?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be happy to make a motion. Move to approve the EFH 5-year review reports and findings and submit it to the National Marine Fisheries Service.
Okay. I have a motion by Mike Luisi, seconded by Michelle Duval. Do we have any?
You don't have any hands.
I see no hands.
Oh, okay. You can just give me a moment to get it on the screen. I'm trying. Okay, sorry about that. There's a lot of slides to scroll through here. A lot of slides to scroll through. Okay, just need to share the screen.
It's up there.
Oh, it's up there now. Perfect. Okay, so it was Luisi Duval?
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for your patience. Oh, okay.
Mike, any rationale to the motion? Okay. Any discussion around the table? Comments from the audience? Jeff?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Council. I'm Jeff Kalin with Lund's Fisheries in Cape May, and I just wanted to comment on this process a little bit, if I could. I hope that the process that Jess just laid out will include going back to the species committees, APs, to unpack kind of the details of what we just saw. I am an EOP committee member. I'm also a habitat, not committee member anymore, advisor, and I'm also a habitat advisor in New England. So we've been tracking this very carefully because when we first certified the squid fisheries under the Marine Stewardship Council program 7 years ago, the fact that this review hadn't occurred at the Mid-Atlantic Council produced a condition of certification. They always come up with something. And so as Jessica and Tori have worked through this, that condition was just dispensed with because you are making progress on this EFH review. And I wanted to thank Jess and Tori for taking time out in the end of February to sit through the audit of our last year. I mean, we've been at it. We got 2 extra years with COVID. I think it was 2018 when we first certified the fishery. So this motion indicates the end of that process. So that's a good thing. But I do think there's an awful lot of detail here that the species APs really need to put their, wrap their heads around, just like I do. I've been tracking this for a long time, and I still don't know what all the details are going to be in this very rapid process laid out for you and all of us until we get something out the door in final form to Garfo. So I'm endorsing the process. I appreciate that we're where we are. And, this investment that we've made in the MSC process over the years, scallops are MSC certified. We've done SCUP. We're doing fluke and black sea bass. Back to the earlier discussion about fisheries going like this and how are we resilient to that kind of an outcome today. And that is to make investments in these certification programs that put us in the top of the markets, both here in the United States and also particularly in Europe. So it's very valuable. And I appreciate the council providing the staff to work with us on these things and help keep these certifications active. So my real point in speaking, other than to give you all that background, was just to say that I hope the species APs will also be engaged in this process, maybe through the fisheries performance report process, so the details can be made available to people about what do the maps look like, mostly we're fishing on mud and sand. So, I wouldn't think we're going to have an awful lot of complex habitat issues here. But anyway, I'm supporting the motion, and I do appreciate the council's support for what I just described to you. Thank you.
Any more comments? Jessica?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up to Jeff's comment about the species advisory panels. That is something that we put some thought into across both the FMAT and the plan development team. And that's part of the reason why we're developing like the demo tool and these other products, because we do anticipate needing to work with the EOP committee and advisors, but also figuring out how to farm this information out to a much broader audience of fishermen and advisors to provide input and really help us refine things. And as you know, on our advisory panels, we have, I think it's close to 120 members across all the different advisory panels. So it's a lot of folks to solicit input from. So that is something that we have been thinking of how we do that beyond, but that's something we can work with you, Michelle, on as we figure out how to move this omnibus action through the process.
Any more comments? Seeing none, are we ready for the question? Let's see if we can make this easy. Are there any objections to the motion? Any abstentions to the motion? The motion passes by consent with one abstention. Anything else you need today, Jessica?
No, I think this is plenty for today.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
you.
Jessica. Thank you, Tori. I do think we do have one announcement, but I would like to make a quick one that I forgot to recognize. Captain Jimmy Hall is our South Council liaison. Hopefully at hospitality night, everybody gets to introduce themselves to him. And with that, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello, everyone. We will have hospitality tonight. The hospitality room is about a mile away from here. So yeah, just I'm being overly dramatic, but it is way at the other end of the complex. It's in 491. So everyone's invited. We'll see you there. Thanks.
All right, with that, we will see everyone tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you very much.